The brother of the Messiah. The brother of the Messiah. Prologue. They are coming for me. I hear their sandals on the stone below, hear the clatter of spears against the courtyard gate, hear the angry voices carried upward by the wind that moves across Jerusalem at dusk. Men who fear memory always come loudly. Men who fear truth never come alone. I am an old man now. My knees ache from years of prayer. My hands are twisted from labor, scarred from stone, wood, rope, and hunger. My beard is white. My eyes are not what they were, though I still see some things more clearly than I did in youth. I see the city. Jerusalem glows red in the evening light. Smoke rises from ovens and altars. Pilgrims crowd the streets. Priests hurry in their garments. Traders shout. Children run between donkeys and baskets. Roman soldiers stand where they do not belong, pretending patience. And above it all, the temple shines. How many times did my brother look upon those stones? How many times did I fail to understand him? The world knows him by many names now. Teacher, prophet, healer, Lord, Messiah, Son of David, Son of God. To me he was first something simpler. He was my brother. I knew the sound of his footsteps before I knew the sound of thunder. I knew the way he laughed before I knew the songs of pilgrims. I knew the roughness of his hands from the workshop before kings ever bent their pride before his name. They say no man can truly know greatness when it grows beside him. That may be true. I did not know. Not when we were boys in Nazareth. Not when I wrestled him in the dust. Not when I mocked his silence. Not when I watched Mother's face change whenever she looked at him. Not when he left home. Not when they nailed him to wood. Only later. Only after death itself lost hold of him. They are coming for me now because I speak his name still. Before they reach these stairs, let me speak once more. Let me tell you what it was to grow beside the one who changed the world. Let me tell you about my brother. Chapter 1. Nazareth was a small place for large destinies. The village clung to the hills of Galilee, like stubborn stone refusing to slide into the valleys below. Dust coated everything in summer. In winter, the roads became mud thick enough to trap sandals. Goats wandered where they pleased. Chickens argued beneath windows before sunrise. Every family knew the sound of every other family's grief. Nothing remained secret for long. If a man drank too much wine, women whispered before evening prayers. If a girl was promised in marriage, children repeated the news through the streets before her father finished telling relatives. If a roof collapsed, or a lamb wandered, or a debt remained unpaid, all Nazareth carried the story together. And yet somehow the greatest mystery in the world grew there unnoticed. Not in a palace, not among scholars, not in Rome, in our house. We were poor, though most around us were poor too, which made poverty feel less like misfortune and more like weather. We measured oil carefully. Water had to be carried. Bread never lasted as long as hunger. Sandals were repaired until straps could bear no more stitching. Still, Mother kept the house orderly. I can still see her in memory before dawn, sleeves folded, dark hair tied back, grinding grain while the first light crept through the doorway. She moved quietly in the mornings, almost prayerfully. Even ordinary tasks seemed sacred around her. As boys, we ruined that peace often. Simon shouted constantly. Joses laughed at everything. Jude asked endless questions. Our sisters chased chickens from the cooking area while arguing over blankets and jars and bread portions. And above all the noise stood Jesus, not apart from us, never distant, but somehow steady while the rest of us crashed through life like loose carts rolling downhill. He was older than me, and as children that difference felt enormous. He knew things first, reached manhood first, worked beside Joseph first. I followed him everywhere when I was small, not because I always liked him, because everyone watched him, Children notice attention quickly. We may not understand it, but we feel its pull. Adults softened around him. Angry men lowered their voices when speaking to him. Mothers trusted him with younger children. Old men asked his help before asking stronger laborers. Even animals behaved strangely near him. Once a wounded stray dog wandered near our doorway, trembling with pain after boys from another village had thrown stones at it. I remember wrinkling my nose in disgust. "Leave it," I said. "It'll die anyway." Jesus crouched beside the animal slowly, speaking softly until its shaking eased. Then he carried it behind the house, cleaned its wounds, and fed it scraps from our own meal. I stared at him in disbelief. "You waste food on dogs now?" Without anger, he answered, "Pain should never be ignored simply because it is common." At the time, I thought it sounded like another one of his strange sayings. Years later, I understood he lived that way toward people too. Joseph worked hard enough for 3 men. By lantern light, he repaired plows, carved beams, shaped handles, fitted doors, and mended wheels cracked by rocky roads. The smell of cedar and fresh-cut wood followed him constantly. Jesus learned quickly beside him. Too quickly, if I am honest. At an age when I still sought excuses to escape chores, he measured accurately, worked patiently, and listened carefully when Joseph taught him. I hated sanding wood. Jesus could spend an hour smoothing rough grain with calm concentration while humming psalms beneath his breath. One afternoon I groaned, tossing aside a rough board. "Why do we keep fixing old things?" I demanded. "No one notices." Jesus kept working. "God notices. That's your answer for everything." He smiled slightly without looking up. "Not everything." "Then why this?" At last he paused, running his fingers across the wood. "Because broken things matter too." I rolled my eyes and walked outside. Only later did I realize he was speaking about more than wood. Nazareth itself was not impressive. Travelers rarely stopped unless forced by weather or exhaustion. Roman soldiers passed through occasionally with the casual arrogance of men who believed the world belonged to them. Tax collectors always seemed cleaner than everyone else, which alone made them suspicious. Still, there was beauty there. Spring covered the hills with wildflowers bright as painted cloth. Vineyards stretched across nearby slopes. At night, the stars looked close enough to touch. Jesus loved the evenings most. After long days of labor, he often sat outside watching the sky darken over Galilee. Sometimes I joined him. Sometimes we argued. I was quicker to anger than any of my brothers. I wanted strength, recognition, certainty. I admired fighters and rebels. Stories of David thrilled me because he carried swords before he carried crowns. Jesus listened differently. When scripture was read in synagogue, he paid attention not only to kings and victories, but to widows, prophets, wanderers, and promises. Once after hearing Isaiah read aloud, he walked home unusually quiet. I asked, "What troubles you?" "Nothing troubles me." "Then why so serious?" He looked toward the road ahead where evening wind lifted dust around our feet. "People hear God's words," he said softly, "but they do not always hear God's heart." I frowned. "What does that even mean?" He laughed then, and for a moment he was simply my brother again. "You ask questions like an old rabbi, and you answer like one. Then perhaps we are both in danger." Mother watched him differently from the rest of us. I noticed it long before understanding it. Sometimes while preparing meals or listening to us argue, her eyes drifted toward him with an expression difficult to describe. Not pride exactly, not fear. Something deeper, as though she carried a memory too heavy for speech. Once, during a storm, lightning shook the house hard enough to wake all of us. My younger sister began crying. Wind howled through cracks in the walls while rain hammered the roof. Jesus rose immediately, comforted her, secured the shutters, and checked each room calmly while thunder rolled overhead. Afterward, while the rest of us struggled back toward sleep, I saw Mother watching him in the flickering lamplight. There were tears in her eyes, not frightened tears, the kind people carry when joy and sorrow live together so closely they can no longer be separated. I almost asked her why, but something stopped me. Some silences feel guarded by heaven itself. Even as a boy, Jesus never rushed to prove himself. That confused me most. Every other young man in Nazareth wanted to be seen, strongest, fastest, cleverest, most respected. Jesus possessed abilities that drew attention naturally, yet he never sought it. When disputes rose among boys, he ended them without humiliating anyone. When older men praised his work, he redirected honor toward Joseph. When insulted, he answered without bitterness sharp enough to wound. I tried once to provoke him deliberately during an argument over work. "You think you're better than everyone?" I snapped. He looked honestly surprised. "No. Then why do people act differently around you?" For a long moment he said nothing. Then quietly, "People are hungry for kindness more than they know." That answer angered me because it sounded true. Truth often angers before it heals. Looking back now as an old man, I think Nazareth misunderstood him partly because he seemed too ordinary. The Holy One should arrive with armies, many believed, or fire, or signs in the heavens, not carrying water jars, not repairing stools, not laughing with children in dusty streets. Yet perhaps that was the miracle already beginning. That greatness could dwell among ordinary life without despising it, that heaven could enter poverty without losing glory, that God could walk slowly enough for children to keep pace beside him. At the time, I knew none of this. I only knew my brother unsettled me in ways I could never fully explain. And the older we grew, the deeper that feeling became. Chapter 2. Every child lies. Anyone who says otherwise remembers childhood poorly. We lied about broken jars, unfinished chores, stolen figs, missing coins, torn cloaks, wandering goats, insults whispered beneath our breath, and fights begun by someone else first. Lying was woven into ordinary survival, except in Jesus. At first I assumed he simply lied better than the rest of us. That seemed more reasonable. But years passed, and I began noticing something unsettling. He would not bend truth even when bending it cost him. One morning Mother discovered a woven basket split along the side near the storage wall. I had damaged it carelessly during rough play and blamed the neighbor's goat before anyone could question me. Mother frowned. Did anyone see what happened? Jesus had. He stood near the doorway, cleaning sawdust from his hands after helping Joseph. I remember staring at him desperately. He could have stayed silent. Instead, he answered gently. James knocked it over while playing. Mother sighed heavily. I felt betrayed. Later, I cornered him behind the house. You always tell on people? I told the truth. You could have said nothing. I could have. Then why didn't you? He leaned against the wall thoughtfully before answering. Because silence can become another way of lying. I hated that answer, not because it was foolish, because somewhere inside I feared it was right. So I threw a stone at him. He ducked easily and laughed. To this day I still do not know whether that laugh calmed me or irritated me more. Jesus was not weak. People who imagine gentleness as weakness never knew him. He worked harder than most grown men by the time he reached adulthood. His hands became rough from tools and labor. He carried beams across long roads beneath brutal sun without complaint. Once during market season, 2 older boys from a nearby village mocked our youngest brother and shoved him into the dirt. I charged forward ready for a fight before Jesus caught my arm. I'll handle it. The boys smirked at him, mistaking calmness for fear. One grabbed his shoulder roughly. The next moment he was flat on his back, staring upward in stunned silence. Jesus had moved so quickly I barely understood what happened. The second boy stepped back immediately. Jesus offered the fallen one his hand. No more. Not anger, authority, the kind requiring no shouting. They left embarrassed, but unharmed. I stared at him afterward. You could fight this whole time. I know enough. Then why avoid it? Because winning a fight can still lose a person? Again with the strange answers. Yet over time I noticed something else. People remembered his mercy longer than his strength. Nazareth children played games in dusty streets until mothers dragged us home by name. We raced downhill paths, wrestled near olive groves, chased goats, climbed rocks, and invented wars against imaginary Romans far braver than the real ones. Jesus joined us often. He was not detached from life. He ran, laughed, sweated, and shouted alongside us. But even during games he remained strangely aware of others. If a child was excluded, he noticed. If someone weaker fell behind, he slowed. If arguments escalated too far, he redirected them before fists landed. I once accused him of ruining perfectly good competitions. He grinned. You only say that because you were losing. I was not. You were. I would have won. You say that every time. I tackled him into the dirt after that. For once he wrestled seriously. To my lasting humiliation, I lost badly. He pinned me effortlessly while trying not to laugh. Yield with dignity, he advised. I hate you. No, you don't. The annoying thing was he sounded completely certain. Joseph trusted him deeply. That mattered in our house more than praise from any rabbi. Joseph rarely spoke unnecessary words. His love appeared through labor, provision, correction, and quiet presence rather than speeches. But with Jesus there was visible pride, not blind pride, measured, respectful. One evening after work, Joseph handed Jesus a difficult carving task, normally reserved for experienced craftsmen. I protested immediately. You trust him with that? Joseph glanced towards me. He listens before acting. A devastating criticism disguised as a compliment. Jesus completed the work beautifully. Of course he did. I inspected it afterward, searching for flaws. There were none. He caught me staring. You're hoping to find a mistake? I'm certain one exists. Then keep looking. The confidence in his voice should have sounded arrogant. Instead, it sounded peaceful. That difference troubled me more than arrogance would have. As we grew older, whispers sometimes followed our family. Not openly, never directly. But enough for a boy to notice. Adults lowered voices around Mother occasionally. Certain travelers stared too long at Jesus in synagogue gatherings. Relatives exchanged glances when conversations turned toward his birth, or old stories from Bethlehem. I once confronted Mother angrily after overhearing fragments of rumor near the well. Why do people talk strangely about him? She became very still. For a moment I thought she might finally explain everything. Instead, she stepped closer and touched my face gently. One day you will understand your brother better. That is not an answer. No, she said softly. It is a promise. At the time, promises felt weaker than answers. Now I know some truths can only arrive when the soul survives long enough to carry them. The older Jesus became, the harder he was to define. He loved deeply, yet remained strangely separate from the hunger for approval ruling most men. He enjoyed ordinary life, yet carried awareness of something beyond it. At times he seemed burdened by knowledge invisible to everyone else. I remember finding him alone outside one night, staring towards the dark hills beyond Nazareth. You planning to become a prophet? I mocked. He smiled faintly. No. Then why do you always look like you're listening for something? For several moments only wind answered. Then he said quietly, because the world is louder than people realize. I laughed at the strangeness of it. But years later, after hearing crowds scream for his death while truth stood bleeding before them, I finally understood what he meant. The world has always been loud. Pride is loud. Fear is loud. Violence is loud. But God often speaks softly enough that only those willing to become quiet can hear him. My brother heard him clearly even then, long before the rest of us knew who walked among us. Chapter 3. The journey to Jerusalem changed everything. Until then, the world for me had been measured mostly by Galilee. Nazareth, Cana, nearby hills, familiar roads, neighboring villages, fields of barley bending beneath the wind. Rome existed like distant thunder. Priests existed in stories and synagogue readings. Jerusalem belonged to Scripture more than life. Then Passover came, and Joseph announced we would travel south. Excitement consumed the house immediately. Mother prepared food for the journey while our younger sisters argued over blankets and bundles. Joseph inspected straps, waterskins, and tools with the seriousness of a man preparing for war. The roads could be dangerous. Thieves watched pilgrim caravans carefully during feast seasons. Jesus, however, grew quieter as departure approached. Not fearful, thoughtful. I noticed him standing outside at dusk several evenings in a row, watching travelers pass along the distant roads toward Jerusalem. "What is it?" I asked him once. He answered without looking at me. "People carry hope there." "That sounds miserable." He laughed softly. "Sometimes it is." The journey south took days. Pilgrims traveled in groups for safety, and by the second day the roads became rivers of people. Families sang psalms while walking. Merchants shouted over donkeys loaded with goods. Children raced ahead until exhausted mothers called them back angrily. The closer we came to Jerusalem, the more the air itself seemed charged. Stories traveled through the caravan constantly. A teacher from Judea arguing with priests, a rebel crucified near Jericho, Roman soldiers searching travelers near the southern roads, prophecies whispered beside campfires. Everywhere people waited for something: deliverance, freedom, a king, a sign. The older men spoke often of Rome with clenched jaws. "They bleed us dry. God will judge them. One day Messiah will come." I remember glancing toward Jesus during those conversations. He listened carefully but said little. At 12 years old, he already carried silence differently than others. Not emptiness, depth. Nothing prepared me for Jerusalem itself. The city rose from the hills like something carved from sunlight and stone. Walls towered over crowded roads. White buildings blazed beneath the sun. Trumpets sounded from the temple courts. Smoke from sacrifices drifted into the sky like endless prayer. Pilgrims filled every street. Languages from distant lands crashed together in the markets. Roman soldiers watched from elevated positions with cold eyes beneath polished helmets. Priests moved through crowds in garments bright as fresh snow. And above all stood the temple. Massive, holy, terrifying. I remember stopping in the street just staring upward. Jesus stood beside me. For once even he seemed overwhelmed, not confused, moved. The temple reflected in his eyes as though he recognized something ancient there. Mother touched his shoulder gently. He looked at her, and for a strange moment neither spoke. Again that silence between them. Again that hidden understanding I could never quite reach. Passover filled the city with tension disguised as celebration. Rome always feared Jewish festivals because crowds breed hope, and hope can become rebellion overnight. Soldiers lined the fortress walls overlooking the temple courts. Horses stamped against stone. Spears gleamed in sunlight. Yet pilgrims kept singing. I loved the noise of Jerusalem at night. Lanterns flickering across rooftops. Songs drifting through crowded streets. The smell of roasted lamb and baking bread. priests reciting prayers while travelers argued theology loudly in every courtyard. Jesus wandered constantly whenever Joseph allowed it. Not recklessly, purposefully. He listened to teachers debate scripture beneath the colonnades. He spoke with old pilgrims resting near the gates. He watched sacrifices with an intensity that unsettled me. One afternoon I found him standing near a group of poor worshippers carrying doves for offering because lambs cost too much. He watched them silently. "What are you staring at?" I asked. He looked troubled. "They give everything they can." "That's what offerings are." "Yes," he said quietly. "But some men standing nearest to God make it harder for them." I followed his gaze toward wealthy merchants arguing prices near the temple courts. Even then, something in him burned against injustice. Not political rage, something deeper, as though holiness itself recoiled from corruption. When the feast ended, our caravan departed northward again. Or so we believed. Traveling groups were large, and families often spread among relatives during the journey. No one worried at first when Jesus was not immediately visible. "He's probably with cousins," I said. Mother nodded distractedly while helping our youngest sister walk the rocky roads. But by evening uncertainty sharpened into fear. He was nowhere. Not among relatives, not among neighbors, not among travelers from Galilee. Joseph searched silently, which frightened me more than shouting would have. Mother's face lost all color. "We go back," Joseph said immediately. Night had already fallen. I still remember that return to Jerusalem. Torches flickering along dark roads, exhaustion pulling at our legs, fear growing heavier with every mile. At first I was irritated with Jesus, then angry, then terrified. Bandits roamed the roads. Roman patrols arrested suspicious travelers easily. Children vanished in crowded cities. 3 days we searched, 3 endless days. Markets, alleys, guest rooms, courtyards, public wells, temple entrances, everywhere. I had never seen Mother so broken. Every time footsteps approached, hope flashed across her face before collapsing again. Joseph barely slept. I realized then how deeply he loved Jesus, despite all the mysteries surrounding him. Perhaps deeper because of them. We found him in the temple, calmly seated among teachers, listening, asking questions, answering questions. Old scholars leaned toward him with expressions I had never seen adults direct toward a child before. Not amusement, attention. One elderly teacher actually looked shaken after Jesus spoke. Mother rushed forward immediately. "Child, why have you done this to us?" she cried. "Your father and I have searched in anguish." Jesus looked genuinely surprised. Not rebellious, almost puzzled. "Why were you searching for me?" he asked softly. "Did you not know I must be in my Father's house?" Silence followed. Heavy silence. The teachers looked between Joseph and Jesus carefully. Joseph said nothing. Mother stared at him with tears gathering in her eyes, and I felt something cold move through me for the first time. Not fear exactly, awareness. As though a door had opened briefly onto something vast and impossible before closing again. We returned to Nazareth afterward. Life resumed outwardly. Work, meals, prayers, seasons. But from that day forward, I never looked at my brother quite the same way again. Chapter 4. Years passed quietly after Jerusalem. Too quietly, perhaps. When people tell stories now about my brother, they leap from wonders at birth to crowds and miracles and storms obeying his voice. But they forget the hidden years, the long ordinary years, the years of wood and sweat and silence, years where heaven lived in obscurity. Nazareth remained unchanged. Dust still gathered in the streets every summer. Roman taxes still emptied pockets already thin. Men still argued politics beneath shaded walls, while women carried water from the wells before sunrise. And every morning Jesus rose to work beside Joseph. No armies came for him, no prophets announced him in the streets, no fire fell from heaven. If he carried greatness within him, he carried it patiently. That patience confused me more than power would have. Joseph depended on him increasingly as age bent his shoulders lower each year. Together they repaired roofs after storms, built storage chests, carved beams, fitted doors, and shaped plows for farmers across Galilee. Jesus became known for careful work, too careful sometimes. Most people won't notice imperfections. I complained once while helping finish a table. He ran his hand across the surface thoughtfully. But the table notices. That makes no sense. It holds weight every day. He answered. Weakness hidden early becomes collapse later. Again, one of those answers that sounded larger than the conversation itself. I groaned loudly. Can you not speak plainly for once in your life? He laughed. You ask difficult questions for someone who dislikes difficult answers. As boys became men around Nazareth, many changed harshly. Rome hardened people. Poverty hardened people. Disappointment hardened people most of all. Young men who once dreamed of heroism became bitter laborers. Some joined zealot groups, whispering rebellion in secret. Others drowned frustration in wine or cruelty. Jesus changed differently. The older he became, the deeper his compassion seemed to grow. That almost sounds weak, spoken aloud. It was not weak. I once watched him stop a fight between two men near the market road. One carried a knife. The other had blood running from his mouth already. Most people backed away. Jesus stepped directly between them. The man with the knife shouted, "Move!" Jesus did not move. Something passed between them, then impossible to describe fully. Not intimidation, authority. The knife lowered slowly. Moments later, both men stood breathing hard while Jesus spoke quietly enough that I could not hear. Eventually one began crying. Crying, the same man who moments earlier looked ready to kill. I remember staring afterward in disbelief. How did you do that? Jesus wiped blood from his sleeve where one of the men had stumbled against him. Most anger is grief looking for permission to strike something. I shook my head. No one talks like this. He smiled slightly. That may be true. Mother worried over him increasingly during those years. Not because he caused trouble, because he did not. Sometimes I caught her watching him work beside Joseph with sadness hidden beneath pride, as though she knew ordinary life could not hold him forever. One evening after supper, I found her alone, grinding grain long after everyone else slept. You're worried about him, I said quietly. She did not pretend otherwise. Yes. Why? He's the most responsible man in Nazareth. That is not what frightens me. Then what does? For a long moment, only the grinding stone answered. Finally, she whispered, Some sons belong partly to the world. I frowned. That sounds like something from the prophets. Perhaps. You always speak in riddles when it concerns him? Her hand slowed. Then she looked at me with tired eyes carrying years of hidden memory. One day, James, you will understand why. Again that promise. Again no explanation. I was beginning to hate promises. Then Joseph died. No miracle prevented it. No angel intervened. Illness took him slowly over weeks until strength drained from his body, like water from cracked clay. Jesus cared for him constantly near the end, changing cloths, carrying water, lifting him gently when pain worsened. I remember one night waking before dawn and seeing Jesus sitting beside Joseph's bed while everyone else slept. Joseph's breathing had become thin and uneven. Jesus held his hand silently. There was sorrow in his face unlike anything I had seen before, not helplessness. Love wounded by mortality itself. Joseph died before sunrise. Mother wept quietly. Our younger sisters clung to one another in terror. I stood numb beside the doorway. Jesus closed Joseph's eyes himself. Then for several moments he simply remained there, kneeling beside the bed with his head bowed. The room felt unbearably heavy, as though grief itself had become a living thing among us. After Joseph's death, Jesus became the center holding our family together. He worked longer hours, took heavier burdens, handled debts, guided us younger brothers firmly when needed. Yet something in him also seemed increasingly distant, not emotionally distant, as though he were listening constantly for a call none of us could hear. At night, he often walked alone outside the village. Sometimes he returned near dawn. Once I followed him secretly into the hills. He knelt there alone, praying beneath the stars, not reciting formal prayers from synagogue, speaking intimately, personally, as though conversing with someone very near. I should have left quietly. Instead, I stepped on loose stones. He turned immediately. For a moment, embarrassment flooded me, but he only smiled. "You walk loudly when spying." "I wasn't spying. You were curious." I crossed my arms defensively. "What were you doing out here?" He looked toward the horizon where first light touched distant hills. "Preparing. For what?" He became very still then. And though he answered gently, something in his voice made my skin rise. For what comes next? Chapter 5. The first rumors arrived before he did. Travelers carried them north from the Jordan like sparks blown ahead of wildfire. A prophet was preaching in the wilderness. Crowds gathered around him daily. Tax collectors trembled before him. Soldiers asked for repentance. Some claimed he might be Elijah returned. His name was John, son of Zechariah. Even Nazareth spoke of little else for weeks. Men argued whether he was truly sent by God or merely another desert fanatic living on insects and visions. Women repeated stories from travelers while drawing water. Young men discussed revolt, prophecy, and Rome with renewed excitement. Every generation in Israel hoped heaven was about to speak again. Most generations died waiting. One evening Jesus announced calmly during supper, "I'm going to the Jordan." The room quieted immediately. Mother stopped tearing bread. I looked up sharply. "Why?" "To hear John." Simon snorted. "Another prophet shouting in the desert." Jesus smiled faintly. "Perhaps. You really believe he's from God?" I asked. "I believe God is moving." There was certainty in the way he said it that unsettled me. Not excitement. Recognition. As though he had been expecting this moment for years. He left before dawn, 2 mornings later. I remember standing in the doorway half awake watching him disappear down the road with travelers heading south. The sunrise behind him painted the hills gold. Mother stood beside me silently. "You knew he would go," I said. She nodded once. "You always know." "No," she whispered. "Not always." There was fear in her voice that morning. Real fear. And for reasons I could not explain, it frightened me too. Jesus remained gone longer than expected. Days became weeks. Nazareth returned outwardly to ordinary life, yet absence lingered around our house like an open doorway no one closed. Joseph's tools still hung where Jesus left them. His sleeping place remained untouched. Neighbors asked questions constantly. "When is your brother returning?" "Did he join the prophet?" "Is it true people are being baptized in the Jordan?" "Have miracles happened?" I answered sharply, more often than necessary, partly from irritation, partly because I did not know what to think. Then the stories grew stranger. Some claimed John had publicly declared Jesus greater than himself. Others spoke of a voice from heaven during baptism. A few swore the Spirit of God descended like a dove. I dismissed most of it immediately. Crowds exaggerate everything. A man trips in mud, and by evening rumor says angels struck him down. Still, beneath my skepticism, unease slowly grew. Too many people spoke his name now. Too many eyes turned toward our family. When he finally returned, I barely recognized him at first. Not physically, something deeper. He carried stillness differently now, like a drawn bow waiting release. He embraced Mother first. She held him longer than usual. No words passed between them for several moments. Then he greeted the rest of us naturally enough, asking about work, harvests, repairs around the house. Outwardly he seemed unchanged, yet the room itself felt altered by his presence, as though he had crossed some invisible threshold while away. That night after supper I confronted him outside. "So," I asked, "was the wilderness enlightening?" He sat on the low stone wall beside the house, looking toward the dark hills. "Yes, that's all. What answer would satisfy you? I want to know what happened." For a while only crickets filled the silence. Then he said quietly, "John prepares the way." "For whom?" At that he looked directly at me, and though his expression remained gentle, something in his eyes struck me with sudden unease. "For what God is about to do," I forced a laugh. "You sound like the prophets now." "No," he said softly. "They sounded like this first. The days afterward became stranger still. Jesus worked less in the shop, not laziness, distance. Sometimes he would stop in the middle of shaping wood and stare out toward the roads beyond Nazareth, as though hearing something none of us could hear. Once I snapped at him in frustration. "You planning to finish that yoke before Messiah comes?" He looked at me calmly. "Perhaps not." I rolled my eyes. "You've changed." "Yes. At least you admit it." He brushed sawdust from his hands slowly. "James, there are moments when life divides forever, before and after. A man cannot remain the same once God calls him forward." His words irritated me because they carried finality, as though he were already leaving us. Then came the wedding at Cana. At first it seemed ordinary enough. Relatives gathered. Music echoed through crowded courtyards. Wine flowed freely. Children ran laughing between tables, while old men argued loudly over scripture and politics. Jesus attended with several new companions who already treated him strangely. Not like friends, like followers. I disliked it immediately. One of them, a fisherman named Peter, watched Jesus constantly, as though expecting impossible things at any moment. Another, John, barely spoke at all unless Jesus addressed him directly. I whispered to Simon, "They look at him like he's a king." Simon muttered back, "Or a madman." I could not decide which troubled me more. Then the wine ran out. An embarrassing disaster for the family hosting the feast. Whispers spread quickly among servants and guests alike. I noticed Mother speaking quietly to Jesus near the courtyard edge. Though I could not hear every word, I caught enough. "They have no wine." Jesus answered softly, almost cautiously, "My time has not yet come." Mother looked at him with that familiar expression again, that strange mixture of sorrow and certainty. Then she told the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." I remember feeling sudden irritation. Why involve him in this? What could he possibly do? Jesus stood silent for several moments before instructing servants to fill large stone jars with water. I nearly laughed aloud. "Water?" But the servants obeyed. Perhaps because of the calm authority in his voice. Perhaps because Mother's confidence unsettled them too. Then came the moment I still struggle to describe fully even now. The servants carried cups from the jars to the master of the feast. He drank, stopped. His entire expression changed. He called loudly for the bridegroom, praising the quality of the wine before all the guests. Confusion rippled across the courtyard. Servants stared into the jars in open shock. Peter looked ready to fall to his knees. "And Jesus!" Jesus simply stood quietly among the celebration, as though heaven had brushed earth for a moment, and only a few people truly noticed. I approached him afterward while music resumed around us. "What did you do?" I whispered harshly. He looked at me steadily. "What was needed?" "That's not an answer." A faint smile touched his face. "You say that often." For once, I had nothing to say back, because for the first time in my life, fear had begun mixing with my doubt. Not fear of him harming us, fear that the stories might actually be true. After Cana, he no longer belonged to Nazareth completely. Crowds followed him increasingly wherever he traveled. Travelers arrived asking questions about him constantly. Some claimed he healed the sick. Others swore demons fled at his command. One man passing through town insisted he saw Jesus restore movement to a crippled arm. Simon dismissed him immediately as drunk. I wanted to agree, but memories of Cana haunted me, and beneath every rumor lay one terrifying possibility I could no longer ignore. What if my brother truly was who people whispered he might be? What would that mean for us, for Israel, for the world itself? I began sleeping poorly after that, because once certain questions enter the soul, they refuse to leave quietly. Chapter 6. Nazareth turned against him faster than I believed possible. That is the danger of small places. People who watched you grow from childhood struggle to accept that heaven may have chosen someone from among them. Familiarity becomes a shield against wonder. At first, the village spoke proudly of him. "That's Joseph's son. He repaired our roof. I remember him carrying water for his mother. He was always different." But pride curdles quickly when greatness refuses to remain manageable. The stories surrounding him grew too large. Healings in Capernaum, demons cast out, crowds gathering by the hundreds, teachers challenged publicly, sinners welcomed openly. Some admired him. Others grew uncomfortable. The synagogue rulers especially disliked the rumors. Authority fears competition instinctively. Then he came home. Word spread through Nazareth before sunrise. Jesus had returned. By midday, the village buzzed like disturbed hornets. Men abandoned work early. Women crowded doorways, whispering. Children ran through the streets, repeating his name. Even I felt restless. Part curiosity, part dread. The synagogue filled beyond capacity that Sabbath. People stood pressed shoulder to shoulder near the walls, while others craned through the doorway from outside. Jesus entered quietly. No grand procession, no dramatic display. Yet the room shifted when he walked in. Everyone felt it. The attendant handed him the scroll of Isaiah. I watched carefully as he unrolled it. His hands did not tremble. Then he began reading. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." His voice carried through the synagogue with calm strength. Not loud, not theatrical, yet every word seemed to settle into the room heavily. He read of good news for the poor, freedom for captives, sight for the blind, release for the oppressed. Then he stopped, rolled the scroll closed, and sat down, every eye fixed upon him. I remember the silence vividly. Even children sensed something unfolding. Then he spoke. "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." The room froze. For several heartbeats no one moved. At first murmurs rose in amazement. "He speaks well. Listen to him. There's wisdom in him." Then suspicion entered. The same poison always enters eventually. "Wait," Isn't this Joseph's son? We know this family. How can he claim such things? I felt tension tightening through the synagogue, like ropes pulled taut before breaking. Jesus looked around slowly, not nervous, sad, as though he already knew what hearts were becoming. Then he spoke again. No prophet is accepted in his hometown. A dangerous sentence. Yet he continued. He spoke of Elijah helping a widow outside Israel, of Elisha healing a foreign leper while many in Israel remained unhealed, outsiders receiving mercy, prideful insiders resisting God. The meaning struck everyone immediately. Anger exploded. Men surged to their feet shouting. Faces reddened. Fists clenched. Years of frustration beneath Roman rule mixed suddenly with wounded pride and religious offense. How dare he? Blasphemy! He insults Israel! Who does he think he is? Someone shoved him hard. Others grabbed his arms. Chaos swallowed the synagogue. I moved instinctively with the crowd, though even now I cannot fully say whether I meant to protect him or stop him myself. Fear ruled me then. Fear more than hatred. Fear of what he might become. Fear of what would happen if the authorities noticed him too closely. Fear that everything in our lives was about to break apart forever. They dragged him toward the cliff outside the village. Nazareth sat among rocky hills, and beyond one ridge the ground dropped sharply into jagged stone below. I still hear the shouting sometimes in dreams, dust choking the air, sandals pounding the earth, men cursing, women crying out behind us, and Jesus in the center of it all somehow remaining calm. That calm terrified me most. Any ordinary man would beg, rage, struggle wildly. He did none of those things. At the edge of the cliff, the crowd pressed around him violently. One shove. That was all it would take. Then something happened I cannot explain even now. No thunder split the sky. No angels appeared. No fire fell. Yet suddenly the fury broke apart like waves striking hidden stone. Men who moments earlier screamed for blood hesitated. Confusion spread through them. And Jesus simply walked forward through the crowd. No one stopped him. No one touched him. He passed beside me close enough that our shoulders nearly brushed. For one brief moment he looked directly into my eyes. Not anger, not accusation, only sorrow. Then he kept walking down the road beyond Nazareth while the crowd stood behind him, stunned into silence. I watched until distance swallowed him. And for the first time in my life, doubt entered my doubt. That night our house felt hollow. Mother sat quietly near the lamp long after everyone else settled into uneasy silence. Simon paced angrily. He provoked them. No. Mother answered softly. Truth provoked them. Simon scoffed. Truth gets men killed. No one replied. I stepped outside, unable to bear the tension. The village had grown quiet again, but unease lingered everywhere. Windows glowed faintly in the darkness. Dogs barked in distant alleys. Wind moved through olive trees along the hillside. Nazareth would never be ordinary again. Neither would our family. The stories multiplied after that. Every week travelers brought new reports. He healed a leper with a touch. He calmed a storm at sea. He cast demons from screaming men. He forgave sins publicly. He spoke with authority greater than the scribes, and crowds followed him everywhere. That last part frightened me most. Crowds are dangerous. Rome tolerated religion. Rome did not tolerate movements. The more his name spread, the more inevitable collision became. I tried convincing myself he would eventually settle down. That excitement would fade, that he would return quietly to Nazareth and the workshop. But deep down I already knew. The road ahead for him led somewhere no ordinary life could follow. Then came the day we went to find him. Some said he was exhausting himself beyond reason. Others whispered more dangerous things. He's lost his senses. He thinks he's chosen. He speaks as though God sent him. Even some relatives urged intervention before authorities acted first. So we went. Mother, myself, and others from the family. The house where he taught was packed so tightly people overflowed into the streets outside. Sick men waited beside the walls. Women held children overhead, trying to bring them close enough for blessing. His disciples guarded the entrance anxiously against the crushing crowd. I remember hearing his voice from inside before seeing him. Steady, compassionate, strong. Someone pushed through and announced loudly, "Your mother and brothers are outside seeking you." The room quieted immediately. Everyone turned toward him, expecting interruption. For a moment he said nothing. Then he looked around at those gathered near him and answered, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" The word struck me like a slap. Before anger could fully rise, he continued, "Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother." The crowd murmured in awe, but I burned with humiliation. What were we then? Had we not grown beside him? Worked beside him? Shared the same roof, the same griefs, the same bread? I turned away before he emerged. Mother did not stop me. She remained standing quietly near the doorway, eyes filled not with offense, but understanding. I hated that look then, because some part of her already stood where I could not yet follow. That evening I confronted her harshly after we returned home. "He shamed us." "No," she answered quietly. "He invited us." "To what?" Her eyes lifted toward the darkening sky outside the doorway. "To believe." I laughed bitterly. "In what? That my brother is the Messiah?" She looked back at me, then with tears gathering silently. "Yes." The certainty in her voice frightened me more than all the miracles, because for the first time I realized she had believed it all along. Chapter 7. Jerusalem drew him like destiny. By the time Passover approached again, everyone knew danger waited there. Even his followers sensed it. I could see fear in them whenever the city was mentioned. Peter tried hiding it beneath boldness. John grew quieter than usual. Others argued constantly about routes, crowds, and rumors from Judea. The priests had begun speaking openly against him now, not merely criticism, hostility. Some claimed he deceived the people. Others accused him of breaking holy law. A few whispered the worst charge possible, blasphemy. Rome, meanwhile, watched all unrest carefully during feast seasons. Jerusalem became a tinderbox every Passover. Pilgrims flooded the city, carrying centuries of longing for freedom. One riot could bring slaughter, and my brother walked directly toward it. Before leaving Galilee, he visited Mother one evening in Nazareth. I remember the light fading through the doorway while they spoke quietly together. The rest of us stayed outside, pretending not to listen. Their voices remained too soft to hear clearly. But I watched Mother's face. At first sorrow, then pride, then the terrible expression of someone accepting pain she cannot prevent. When he emerged later, he found me waiting near the road. "You're really going?" I said. "Yes." "You know what's waiting there." "I know." "Then why walk into it?" He studied me carefully for several moments. "Because truth must be spoken where lies rule strongest." "That sounds noble," I snapped, "until you end up dead." The words hung between us heavily. For the first time I saw exhaustion touch his face. Not fear, grief. "James," he said quietly, "there are worse things than death." Then he embraced me unexpectedly. A long embrace. The kind given before separation neither person fully wishes to name. When he finally stepped away, unease settled into my chest like cold iron. Something irreversible had begun. News traveled quickly once he entered Jerusalem. Crowds greeted him outside the city shouting psalms. Some spread cloaks across the road before him. Others waved palm branches crying out, "Son of David!" Dangerous words, messianic words. Rome crucified men for less. Nazareth buzzed with argument immediately after travelers brought reports northward. He's provoking them intentionally. Maybe he truly is the chosen one. Chosen men do not survive Rome. I could not stay away. Within days I traveled south myself, not openly with his followers, not yet. Part of me still resisted. Part of me still hoped to pull him back somehow before disaster consumed us all. Jerusalem during Passover felt like a city holding its breath. Pilgrims packed every street. Roman soldiers stood at intersections, gripping spears tightly. Priests moved through the temple courts with visible tension beneath ceremonial dignity. And everywhere people spoke his name. Some with hope, some with hatred, some with fear. I found him teaching near the temple surrounded by crowds so thick movement became difficult. His voice carried above the noise effortlessly. He spoke of justice, mercy, hypocrisy, faithfulness, judgment, especially judgment. He no longer softened his words toward the religious leaders. That frightened me deeply. A man may survive offending crowds. He rarely survives humiliating powerful men publicly. I pushed closer through the crowd until I finally stood near enough to see him clearly. He looked tired, not weak, burdened, as though he carried sorrow for people who did not yet realize they were destroying themselves. Then suddenly the crowd erupted around us, shouting near the money changers, animals panicking, coins scattering across stone. I turned in shock. Jesus had overturned the merchants' tables. Doves burst upward in frantic wings. Silver rolled across the courtyard. Traders screamed curses while pilgrims stumbled backward in confusion. And my brother stood in the middle of it all, burning with righteous fury, unlike anything I had ever seen. "God's house was not made for greed." The force in his voice shook even the men trying to confront him. For one terrifying moment, I thought bloodshed would begin instantly. But no one moved against him. Not yet. Even the priests seemed stunned. I realized then something I should have understood years earlier. His gentleness had never been weakness. It was restrained strength. And when holiness finally confronted corruption openly, even powerful men recoiled. That night I could not sleep. Jerusalem groaned beneath restless crowds and distant marching soldiers while I lay awake staring into darkness. Everything was accelerating now. There would be no quiet return to Nazareth, no peaceful ending. Either heaven itself stood behind my brother, or destruction waited only days ahead. I no longer knew which possibility frightened me more. Over the following days, tension tightened around him constantly. He taught openly in the temple despite threats. He debated priests publicly and left them humiliated before crowds. People followed him everywhere now, some hoping for miracles, some hoping for revolution, some hoping to trap him in dangerous words. His followers looked increasingly anxious. Once I overheard Peter whisper urgently, "They're going to arrest you." Jesus answered calmly, "I know. No panic. No attempt to flee. Only certainty. How could a man walk so steadily toward suffering?" I did not understand then. Perhaps I still do not fully understand now. Then came the supper. I was not in the upper room with the 12 that night, but later I heard enough pieces to imagine it clearly. Bread broken, wine shared, warnings spoken, promises made, and beneath it all, farewell. One of his own followers left during the meal. Judas, even now speaking that name tastes bitter. How close evil can stand to goodness while remaining unchanged. The arrest came at night. Cowardice prefers darkness. I woke to frantic pounding at the door where I stayed among relatives. "He's been taken." Everything afterward became fragments, running through narrow streets, torches flickering against stone walls, crowds gathering half-dressed from sleep, Roman armor flashing red beneath firelight. I reached the courtyard near the high priest's house just in time to see him led inside, bound like a criminal. Bound. My brother, who had healed the sick and fed the hungry, stood surrounded by armed men as though he were dangerous. Perhaps he was. Truth always is. The trial unfolded in confusion and fury. Witnesses contradicted one another. Priests demanded answers. Crowds shifted mood by the hour. I stayed at the edges, hiding my face beneath my cloak. Cowardice again. Part of me still feared being tied publicly to him. Then came the question that changed everything. "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed?" Silence held the room. Had he denied it then, perhaps things might have changed. Perhaps. But truth remained truth, even with death waiting beside it. "I am." Simple words. Yet the room exploded instantly. Blasphemy, condemnation, rage. Some struck him, others spat on him. I stood frozen watching men assault the kindest person I had ever known. And still he did not answer violence with violence. No curses, no threats, only sorrow. As though he grieved for them even while they condemned him. That broke something inside me more completely than anger ever could. Near dawn, they delivered him to Pilate. The city already stirred awake as crowds gathered outside the governor's fortress. Roman authority always smelled of iron, sweat, and fear. Pilate looked irritated more than outraged, like a man dragged unwillingly into another people's religious hatred. Yet politics traps even powerful men. The priests demanded death. The crowds shifted wildly between accusation and excitement. And there stood Jesus, bruised, bleeding, silent. I remember suddenly thinking of Nazareth, of him repairing chairs beside Joseph, of him laughing while wrestling us in dusty streets, of him carrying water jars for mother. How could the same hands now be bound before Rome? The world itself felt wrong suddenly, broken at its deepest foundation. And somewhere beneath the noise rising around the fortress, I realized with growing horror, this would not end with release. Chapter 8. They led him through the streets at sunrise. Jerusalem had fully awakened by then. Merchants opened stalls, pilgrims crowded the roads, priests hurried toward morning duties, pretending holiness could survive beside injustice carried openly through the city. And through it all walked my brother beneath Roman guard. The beam across his shoulders looked impossibly heavy after the beatings. Blood streaked down his back, where the whip had torn flesh open. Soldiers mocked him openly while crowds pressed close enough to see suffering without sharing it. Some shouted insults, others wept. Many simply stared. Human beings are drawn to tragedy even when it reveals their own ugliness. I followed at a distance at first. Cowardice still clung to me like smoke. Every time Roman soldiers glanced toward the crowd, fear tightened my chest. Association alone could destroy a man. Arrests spread quickly during feast seasons. Yet no matter how slowly I walked, I could not leave. Because whatever else he was still my brother. At one narrow street near the city gate, he stumbled beneath the beam and collapsed hard against the stone. The sound of wood striking the ground echoed sharply. A soldier cursed immediately and struck him. I flinched at the blow. The crowd surged restlessly around us while Jesus struggled to rise. Then something happened I have never forgotten. Even there, even broken beneath Roman punishment. He turned toward a group of women weeping nearby and spoke words of comfort to them. Comfort, not for himself, for them. I remember staring in disbelief. What kind of man thinks first of others while walking toward death? No ordinary man. That realization settled deeper into me with every step toward Golgotha. The hill outside the city looked smaller than I expected, almost ordinary. That seemed wrong too. One imagines history choosing grand places. But death often occurs in ugly, practical spaces where empire wishes suffering visible. Romans understood spectacle. Crosses warned the living through the dying. This is what happens to those who challenge power. Soldiers forced him onto the wood. I almost looked away then. Almost. But something kept my eyes fixed upon him, despite horror rising inside me. The hammer strikes echoed across the hill, a sound no one who hears it ever truly forgets. Metal through flesh. Wood shaking beneath impact. Some women cried aloud. Others collapsed, sobbing. I could not move at all. The world narrowed to sound and blood and unbearable helplessness. Then they raised the cross upright. My brother hung against the sky between earth and heaven, while Jerusalem carried on in the distance, as though ordinary life still existed. Mother stood nearer than I did. That shames me even now. She remained beneath the cross despite soldiers, despite grief, despite danger. John stood beside her, holding her upright when weakness overtook her. I finally forced myself closer near midday. When Mother saw me, tears filled her eyes instantly. Not accusation, relief, as though simply having another son beside her helped her survive what no mother should witness. Jesus saw us too. Even dying, he noticed. That was always his way. Pain never blinded him to others. His breathing had become labored by then. Each word cost him effort. Yet he looked toward Mother first, then toward John. Take care of her. Simple words, but spoken with such tenderness that grief nearly crushed me outright. Even on the cross he remained himself completely. Loving, thinking of others, giving what little strength remained away freely. Hours passed beneath a darkening sky. The air itself felt wrong, heavy, charged. Priests mocked him openly below the cross. Save yourself. If you are chosen by God, come down. Soldiers laughed. Crowds shifted constantly around the hill. Some curious, some hateful, some secretly afraid. And still he endured. No curses against Rome, no cries for vengeance. Only fragments of prayer and mercy carried through broken breaths. At one point he whispered, "Father, forgive them. Forgive them." Even now, those words astonish me more than miracles. Most men become smaller through suffering. Pain strips away pretense until bitterness stands exposed. But suffering revealed something greater in him instead, as though love itself burned brightest when darkness tried hardest to extinguish it. By afternoon, the sky had dimmed unnaturally. Wind swept across the hill carrying dust through the crowds. People grew uneasy. Even soldiers looked upward repeatedly. I remember one Roman centurion staring at Jesus with troubled eyes, as though witnessing something beyond execution. Then came the cry, loud, terrible, a sound torn from depths beyond physical pain alone. And after it, silence, the kind that falls when creation itself pauses. His head lowered, his body slackened, and suddenly the world felt emptier than I believed possible. My brother was dead, not sleeping, not hidden, dead. The one who healed others, the one crowds called Messiah, the one Mother believed in from the beginning, gone. Then the earth shook, violently. Stone cracked beneath our feet. People screamed and stumbled. Dust poured from nearby rocks while the hill trembled beneath us. Some fled instantly in terror. Others dropped to their knees, praying. The centurion near the cross stared upward, pale-faced, and whispered something I barely heard through the chaos. Surely this man was righteous. I think part of the world understood before I did. Evening approached quickly afterward. Jewish law demanded burial before Sabbath. A wealthy council member named Joseph from Arimathea requested the body from Pilate. I watched in numb silence as they lowered Jesus from the cross carefully. Mother held him then. No words, only grief too deep for language. The image remains carved into my soul more sharply than any memory of childhood. The same arms that once carried him as an infant now held him lifeless beneath gathering darkness. What prophecy can prepare a mother for that? They laid him in a nearby tomb before nightfall. The stone rolled shut with dreadful finality. I stood there long after others began leaving, unable to move, unable to think clearly. Everything inside me had collapsed. If he truly was chosen by God, how could this happen? If he was not, then why had heaven itself seemed to move around him? Nothing made sense anymore, not miracles, not scripture, not hope. Only grief remained certain. That Sabbath became the longest day of my life. Jerusalem grew strangely quiet beneath the holy day restrictions, but inwardly my thoughts screamed without rest. I stayed hidden indoors with others for much of the day. Fear spread among us all now. If Rome killed the leader, followers might come next. Some disciples wept openly. Others sat in silence, staring at nothing. Peter looked shattered beyond words. And Mother frightened me most. Not because she raged, because she did not. She moved quietly through the room, comforting others despite her own agony. At one point I finally demanded softly, "How can you still be calm?" She looked at me with exhausted eyes, carrying oceans of sorrow. "Because I remember what God promised." I nearly broke then. How can promises matter now? For a moment pain crossed her face so deeply I regretted the question instantly. Yet when she answered, her voice remained steady. "Because death is never the end with him." I wanted to believe her, but the stone sealing the tomb felt heavier than faith itself. Chapter 9. Before dawn on the third day, pounding shook the door hard enough to wake everyone inside. Voices erupted outside in confusion. I sat upright instantly, heart racing. For one terrible moment I thought soldiers had come for us next. Peter rushed past me toward the entrance while others stumbled awake around the room. When the door opened, several women burst inside, breathless and trembling. "The tomb is open!" People began speaking all at once. "The stone is gone." We went at sunrise. "There was no body. Angels said he lives." Someone started weeping loudly. Another person laughed in disbelief. Peter ran out immediately with John close behind him. I remained frozen. The room itself felt unstable suddenly, as though reality had loosened beneath our feet. One thought battled against another inside me. Impossible, but what if— No, dead men do not rise. Rome made certain of death. I had seen the nails, the blood, the spear wound, the burial. Hope can become madness quickly after grief. I convinced myself that must be happening now. Hours passed in chaos. People rushed in and out carrying rumors impossible to untangle. Some claimed they had seen him alive near the garden. Others swore the priests stole the body. A few believed grave robbers had taken him. Jerusalem buzzed with confusion before noon. I withdrew from the others eventually and climbed alone to the rooftop, where cool morning wind swept across the city. I needed silence. Below me, life continued strangely unchanged. Merchants reopened stalls. Pilgrims crowded streets. Roman patrols marched their usual routes. Smoke rose from ovens across the city. How could the world continue so normally after such horror? I leaned against the rooftop wall, exhausted beyond sleep. And for the first time since his death, anger flooded me fully. Not at Rome, not at priests, at him. Why had he walked willingly toward death? Why leave mother shattered? Why speak in riddles no one understood until too late? Why awaken hope so fiercely only to vanish beneath a stone? I covered my face with my hands. I don't understand you, I whispered into the wind. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Calm, familiar. My entire body went still. Slowly I turned, and there he stood, alive. No vision could have prepared me, no prophecy, no dream. He stood only a few steps away beneath the morning light, wearing the same face I had known since childhood. Yet changed, too, not less human. More. The wounds remained visible in his hands and side, but death no longer clung to him. The exhaustion and suffering from the cross were gone. Peace surrounded him so deeply, the air itself seemed different near him. For several moments I could neither breathe nor move. My mind rebelled against my own eyes. This cannot be real. But memory crashed against memory. Cana, the healings, the authority in his voice, the stillness during the storm of hatred in Nazareth, the impossible calm before Pilate. And now this. He smiled gently. James, only my name. Yet hearing it shattered something inside me completely. I fell to my knees before I even realized I was moving. Every argument I had built against belief collapsed at once beneath the simple reality of him standing alive before me. Tears blurred my sight instantly. I was wrong, I whispered brokenly. The words felt far too small. Wrong about him. Wrong about God. Wrong about nearly everything. He stepped closer and raised me to my feet. No anger, no triumph, no humiliation. Only love. That undid me more than judgment ever could have. For a long while we simply stood there together while Jerusalem moved below us, unaware that death itself had been defeated above its rooftops. I stared at him repeatedly, almost expecting him to disappear. You're real, I said finally, still struggling to believe it. A soft laugh escaped him. Yes. But I saw you die. I know. How? Again that familiar smile touched his face. You always ask the largest questions first. Despite tears, despite shock, despite everything, I almost laughed too. Some things about him, even resurrection, had not changed. We spoke long that morning. Much of it remains too sacred for easy repetition. Not secret. Simply holy in ways ordinary speech cannot carry fully. But I remember fragments clearly. He spoke of fulfillment, of victory through suffering, of the kingdom beginning like seed before harvest, and he spoke of forgiveness, not abstractly, personally. James, he said quietly at one point, you feared losing your brother, but you were never losing me. Those words pierced me deeply because they revealed how much fear had ruled my life. Fear of shame, fear of Rome, fear of disappointment, fear of believing too much. Fear had kept me standing at the edges while truth walked directly before me for years. Yet even my doubt had not driven him away. At one point I finally asked the question buried deepest in my heart. Did Mother know? A look passed across his face, then unlike any I had seen before. Tenderness, honor, grief. Mother carried faith long before understanding. He answered softly. That sounded exactly like him, a sentence both mysterious and perfectly clear at once. Before leaving, he embraced me. Not as teacher to follower, as brother to brother. Yet even then I understood our relationship had changed forever. The man I had wrestled in Nazareth dust was now the risen Lord standing beyond death itself. And somehow he remained completely the same person too. Still gentle, still steady, still seeing directly into the soul. When he finally stepped away, sunlight caught the scars in his hands. Scars remained. That struck me powerfully. Resurrection had not erased suffering entirely. It had transformed it. After he departed, I remained alone on the rooftop for a long time, unable to move. The city below looked different now. Every stone, every rooftop, every breath of wind. Hope itself had become real again. No, more than hope, certainty. Death was not ultimate. Rome was not ultimate. Fear was not ultimate. God had spoken his answer through my brother. And suddenly I understood why the grave could not hold him. Because life itself had always lived within him too fully for death to keep. When I returned downstairs, the others looked toward me immediately. Something in my face must have revealed everything before words came. Peter stood first. "You saw him?" Not a question. I nodded slowly. Silence swept the room. Then tears, laughter, praise rising like sudden fire after endless darkness. And for the first time since childhood, I no longer stood outside belief looking inward. I belonged to it completely. Not because someone persuaded me, because I had seen my brother alive after death. No argument can overpower that. No empire can silence it. No grave can bury it again. Chapter 10. The days after his rising felt like standing between two worlds. Jerusalem remained unchanged outwardly. Roman banners still hung above the fortress. Priests still moved through the temple courts in polished robes. Merchants still shouted over prices in crowded streets. Yet beneath ordinary life, everything had changed forever. Because he was alive. Not memory, not legend growing through grief. Alive, he appeared among us many times during those weeks. Sometimes in crowded rooms thick with fear. Sometimes beside meals where conversation died the moment he entered. Once near the Mount of Olives beneath dawn light turning the sky gold above Jerusalem. Each appearance carried the same strange mixture of familiarity and awe. We knew him instantly. Yet being near him now felt like standing near the edge of eternity itself. Death had touched him and failed to keep him. No one who witnessed that remained ordinary afterward. The disciples changed most visibly, Peter especially. Only weeks earlier fear had crushed him. I saw the shame in his eyes after the trial, though no one needed to speak aloud what had happened in the courtyard. But after seeing Jesus alive, fear no longer ruled him. None of us became fearless entirely. Only fools feel no fear. But fear stopped becoming master. That difference changed everything. We gathered constantly now in prayer and remembrance, sometimes in upper rooms hidden from authorities, sometimes quietly among trusted families in the city. We broke bread together and repeated his words again and again, trying to understand mysteries larger than our minds. Often late at night we would speak about small memories of him. The way he smiled before telling a difficult truth. The way children trusted him immediately. The look in his eyes before miracles happened. How he always noticed suffering others ignored. No one tired of speaking his name. It felt less like remembering the dead and more like learning how fully alive he had always been. One evening after prayer, Peter sat beside me overlooking the city rooftops. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then finally he said quietly, "I understand now why he chose you too." I glanced toward him. Chose me for what? To help lead after him. I almost laughed at the idea. Peter, I doubted him until the end. So did many. You followed him openly. Peter looked away into the dark. I also failed him openly. Pain still lingered there. Deep pain. I remembered hearing fragments of what happened during the arrest, the denials, the shame afterward. Yet Jesus had restored him too. That was his way. Not discarding broken people. remaking them. Peter sighed heavily. He knew what we would become before we did. The truth of that settled over us quietly, while wind moved across the rooftops. Then came the day of ascension. Even now, words fail me there. We followed him outside the city toward the Mount of Olives. Morning sunlight covered Jerusalem behind us, while pilgrims moved along distant roads, unaware. History itself stood breathing nearby. He spoke to us about the kingdom again. Not armies, not revolt, not vengeance against Rome. The kingdom of God moved differently than men expected, like seed beneath soil, like light entering darkness gradually until darkness could no longer remain. Some still asked questions about restoring Israel politically. Jesus answered patiently, though I sensed sadness beneath it. Even after resurrection, we struggled to understand the true nature of his reign. Then he blessed us. I remember his hands raised, the scars visible still, and somehow that mattered deeply to me. The marks of suffering remained part of glory. Then, before our eyes, he departed. No poet can fully capture that moment honestly. Wonder mixed with grief, joy mixed with longing. He was gone from sight, and yet somehow nearer than ever before. We stood staring upward long after the sky emptied. Finally, John whispered beside me, "What do we do now?" I heard my brother's voice in memory immediately. "Feed the hungry. Love one another. Remain faithful. Do not fear." Simple commands, difficult ones, holy ones. Afterward we returned to Jerusalem together, not as frightened followers hiding from Rome, as witnesses. That word carried weight now. Witnesses speak what they have seen regardless of consequence, and we had seen too much to remain silent. Still, uncertainty lingered among us. What would happen next? Would the authorities arrest us all? Would Rome crush this movement before it spread beyond Jerusalem? Would people believe such impossible news? At times the burden felt overwhelming. Then I remembered the rooftop, the wounds in his hands, the sound of my name spoken by someone who had conquered death itself, and peace returned again. Days later we gathered in prayer together during the feast. The room overflowed with voices lifted toward God when suddenly everything changed. Wind roared through the house, though no storm touched the city outside. Not ordinary wind. Power. Living power. The sound filled every corner around us until some fell trembling to the floor. Then came light. Flames appearing above heads without consuming anything they touched. Awe seized all of us instantly. I remember Peter staring upward speechless while others wept openly. And inside me, something awakened fully at last. Not excitement, strength. As though heaven itself breathed through fragile human hearts. People outside heard the noise quickly and gathered in confusion below. Pilgrims from many lands crowded the streets asking questions. Then the impossible began. Men and women among us spoke languages they had never learned, proclaiming the greatness of God to strangers from distant nations. Some in the crowd stood stunned, hearing their own native tongues spoken by Galileans. Others mocked immediately. Too much wine. Human beings often choose ridicule when wonder frightens them. Peter stepped forward before the crowd. The same Peter who once trembled before servant girls now spoke with authority, carrying across the streets of Jerusalem itself. He proclaimed Jesus openly. Crucified, risen, exalted, no hesitation remained in him. And as he spoke, I looked around at the faces gathering in the crowd. Hungry faces, wounded faces, searching faces. The same kinds of people Jesus had always noticed first. Suddenly I understood something clearly. His work had not ended. It had begun spreading. Through us now. Broken people remade by the living presence of the one we once watched die. That evening thousands gathered with us, praying, eating. asking questions deep into the night. Jerusalem pulsed with rumors and astonishment, while fear slowly gave way to joy among the believers. I slipped away briefly toward the rooftop alone near midnight. The city glowed beneath countless lamps. Voices drifted upward through warm night air. And there, beneath the stars above Jerusalem, I finally whispered aloud. Words my heart had resisted for years. My brother is Lord. Not metaphor, not poetry, truth. And for the first time in my life, every piece of the story fit together at last. Nazareth, the temple, the healings, the cross, the empty tomb. God had walked among us wearing ordinary flesh, and somehow, impossibly, he had chosen our family to bear witness to it. Chapter 11. James the Just. They began calling me James the Just long before I believed I deserved it. Jerusalem gives names quickly, sometimes out of love, sometimes mockery, sometimes hope. I accepted none of them easily. For years after my brother's death and rising, I lived quietly among the believers in the city. We gathered in homes, in courtyards, in shaded corners near the temple. We prayed often. We shared food when we could. Widows and orphans came among us because no one else noticed them long enough to care. The city changed around us. Pilgrims arrived every season carrying rumors from distant provinces. Roman banners still hung over our streets like insults nailed to the sky. Priests argued among themselves behind polished walls while beggars slept beside the temple gates. And always there was tension. People expected revolt. Some wanted swords, some wanted signs from heaven, some wanted Rome burned to the ground, others only wanted enough bread to survive another winter. Yet my brother had spoken of another kingdom. Not one carried by spears. One carried inside men first. That teaching angered many. The zealots thought us weak. Some Pharisees thought us dangerous. Priests feared losing influence over the people. Rome feared crowds no matter what they preached. Still the gatherings grew. I spent many hours in prayer within the temple courts. Some days I remained there so long my knees stiffened when I rose. The stones beneath me became familiar companions. Old merchants nodded when they passed me. Children sometimes sat nearby in silence. Even some priests who opposed us privately admitted respect. I ate little, slept little, spoke carefully. Perhaps age was already entering me early. Or perhaps sorrow ages men faster than years. People came seeking judgment in disputes. A widow cheated of inheritance. Two brothers quarreling over land boundaries. A laborer denied wages. A husband furious with his wife. A young man asking whether vengeance honors God. I tried always to remember my brother's voice before answering. Not merely his words, his way. There was strength in him without cruelty, authority without pride, holiness without distance. That balance is harder than miracles. One afternoon, a young fisherman approached while rain clouds gathered over the city. "Rabbi," he asked me, what was he like before the crowds? The question struck me harder than he knew. Before the crowds, before the healings, before the shouting, before crosses and empty tombs. I looked toward the temple walls glowing pale beneath darkening skies. He noticed people others ignored. I said quietly. The fisherman waited for more. I surprised myself by smiling. "When we were boys," I said, "he once stopped half a morning to help a lame dog pull itself from a ditch. I mocked him for it. He answered, 'Suffering should never be entertainment.'" The young man laughed softly. "That sounds like him." "Yes," I said. "It does." Rain began falling then, tapping against stone. For a moment I was no longer an old man in Jerusalem. I was a barefoot boy in Nazareth again, watching my brother kneel in dust beside broken things. As years passed, believers from distant lands came to Jerusalem seeking guidance. Some arrived speaking strange dialects. Some carried scars from persecution. Others carried questions heavier than packs on their backs. Do we still belong among God's people? Can mercy reach us too? Will the kingdom truly come? I answered as faithfully as I could. Not as a scholar trying to impress, as a witness, because I had known him. I had eaten beside him, argued with him, doubted him, and finally seen him alive after death. No philosophy can erase that. At times I wondered why my brother appeared to me at all after rising. Peter had followed him openly. John loved him fiercely. Many others had remained faithful longer than I had. But me? I had doubted, mocked, resisted. Perhaps that is why he came. Because broken faith, once restored, can strengthen others who think themselves beyond hope. Still, danger thickened yearly around Jerusalem. Rome grew harsher. Revolutionary whispers multiplied in alleyways and taverns. Young men sharpened knives in secret and quoted prophets loudly. The high priesthood became more political with each passing season. Influence mattered more than holiness to many who wore sacred garments. And in the middle stood our movement, too Jewish for Rome, too dangerous for some priests, too peaceful for zealots, too certain to disappear. One evening after prayer, an elderly priest approached me privately beneath the colonnades. "You still have time," he said quietly. "To do what?" "To separate yourself from this." This had become the word many used instead of speaking my brother's name. I studied the old priest carefully. His eyes were tired, not cruel. "You respected him once," I said. He looked away. "I respected many things once." "Then why warn me?" "Because storms are coming to Jerusalem, and storms crush men standing in open places." I remembered another storm years earlier on Galilean waters, though I had only heard the story afterward from fishermen who still trembled describing it. My brother sleeping while waves rose, then standing, then speaking peace into chaos as though commanding servants. I looked back at the priest. "The storm has already come," I said, "and he still stands." The old man left without answering. That night, sleep escaped me. I walked the rooftops beneath moonlight, listening to distant sounds of the city. Dogs barked, soldiers laughed somewhere near the fortress. A woman sang softly while grinding grain late into the night. Ordinary sounds. Yet beneath them lay unease. Empires always believed themselves eternal. Jerusalem's leaders believed the same. But corruption weakens foundations long before walls crack. I feared judgment was coming upon the city. Not because God delights in destruction, because pride deafens men even when mercy stands shouting before them. Sometimes I still dreamed of Nazareth. Not the miracles, not the crowds, simple things. Mother kneading bread. Joseph repairing a stool near the doorway. My younger brothers arguing over olives. Jesus sitting outside at dusk watching swallows circle the rooftops. Peaceful moments become holy once they are gone. I remember asking him once, long before any of us understood who he truly was, "Do you ever wish you had been born somewhere greater than Nazareth?" He looked genuinely puzzled. "Why?" "So people would know you." He smiled slightly. God sees small places. At the time I thought the answer disappointing. Now I think kingdoms rise and fall trying to learn what he already knew. The people continued calling me James the Just, yet if I was just at all, it was because I had spent years watching justice walk beside me wearing dust-covered sandals. My brother never hurried past pain, never used truth as a weapon to humiliate, never confused power with righteousness. The memory of him corrected me constantly. When anger rose, I remembered his patience. When pride whispered, I remembered washing basins and carpenter's tools. When fear came, I remembered the wounds in his risen hands. Those wounds changed everything. Not because they proved strength, because they revealed love stronger than death itself. Chapter 12. Memories of Home. Old age does not preserve grand moments best. It preserves details. The way lamplight touched Mother's face when she listened to Scripture. The sound of Joseph coughing after long days breathing sawdust. The smell of rain entering Nazareth streets after dry months. The creak of leather straps as donkeys passed before dawn. And always, my brother among those memories. People imagine holiness wrongly. They imagine distance, coldness, constant solemnity. But Jesus was alive in every ordinary moment. He laughed often. Not carelessly, but fully. Once during harvest season, Simon slipped carrying water jars downhill and rolled nearly into a thorn bush, while all of us shouted with laughter. Even Jesus laughed so hard he had to sit against a stone wall wiping tears from his eyes. I remember thinking then, if heaven exists, surely laughter belongs there. Yet there were moments even in childhood when silence surrounded him differently. At synagogue readings, he listened as though hearing voices beneath the words. During prayers, stillness settled around him so deeply that even restless children lowered their noise. And sometimes Mother watched him with an expression I only understood years later. Not confusion, not fear exactly. Memory, as though she carried knowledge too large for speech. I once asked her directly when I was perhaps 15, "Why do you look at him that way?" She paused while kneading dough. "Because God has been kind to me." I groaned at the answer. "You speak like the synagogue teachers." She smiled faintly. "And you speak like your father." At the time I thought she meant Joseph. Now I wonder. After Joseph died, the house changed forever. Grief removes structure from a family the way removing beams weakens a roof. Jesus carried much after that. Long hours, heavy burdens, responsibilities none of us younger ones fully understood. Yet he never spoke bitterly. That may have been the strangest thing of all. Most men under pressure harden. He deepened instead. I remember one winter evening after exhausting labor repairing storm damage outside Cana. We returned soaked and freezing. Our meal was poor, even by our standards. I complained constantly about Rome, about taxes, about weather, about work. Jesus listened while drying his cloak near the fire. Finally I asked, "Does nothing anger you?" "Oh, many things anger me." "Then why do you sound calm?" He looked into the fire before answering. "Because anger is safest when carried by love." I did not understand then. Years later, watching him confront corruption in the temple, I finally did. Children in Nazareth admired him even before his public ministry. Animals trusted him strangely. Old men sought him for help. Women asked him to carry burdens heavier men ignored. He never refused unless urgency called him elsewhere. I once accused him of enjoying being admired. He laughed. "You think too highly of Nazareth." Perhaps he was right. Still, people felt something around him they could not name. Peace, maybe, or truth. Some were drawn toward it. Others resented it instantly. Light has always divided men. One memory returns to me more than others now. A summer evening. The sky red beyond the hills. Jesus and I sitting on the roof after work. For once, neither of us argued. Below us, Nazareth settled toward sleep. Dogs barked. Mothers called children indoors. Lamps flickered awake one by one. He looked towards the horizon for a long time. Then he said quietly, "James, promise me something." "What?" "When the time comes, do not let fear decide who you are." I laughed nervously. "What time?" But he only smiled. Years later, standing after seeing him alive again, those words returned sharper than nails. Fear had ruled me often, fear of shame, fear of Rome, fear of losing certainty, fear of losing him. Yet in the end, love proved stronger. His love first, then mine after learning from it. People now argue over doctrines, laws, prophecies, kingdoms, mysteries. Scholars debate endlessly. Perhaps they must. But when I remember my brother most clearly, I do not first remember sermons. I remember him carrying water to mother before she asked. I remember him repairing children's toys no one else considered worth fixing. I remember him stopping on roads to speak with lonely men others avoided. I remember him singing psalms beneath stars. And I remember the terrible beauty of realizing one day that the hands shaping wood beside me had shaped worlds before time began. No man fully recovers from such knowledge. Chapter 13. The Weight of Memory. The older I became, the more people asked about him. Not theology at first, not prophecy, not Rome or kingdoms or signs. They wanted stories. What was he like as a boy? Did he laugh often? Did he know who he was when he was young? What angered him? What made him quiet? Did he ever grow weary? At first I struggled to answer those questions. How do you explain sunlight to someone born underground? How do you explain the sea to a man who has only known wells? Most people knew my brother through teachings, miracles, and stories already spreading across distant lands. I knew him before crowds followed him, before fishermen left their nets, before priests feared his name. I knew him when he carried water jars through Nazareth dust and came home exhausted from labor beside Joseph. And somehow those memories moved people most deeply. Perhaps because greatness feels nearer when clothed in ordinary life. The believers often gathered late into the night now. Jerusalem remained dangerous after dark, but people still came quietly through narrow streets carrying bread, oil lamps, and questions in tired hearts. Widows sat beside laborers. Former beggars prayed beside merchants. Children fell asleep against their mothers while scripture was read softly by lamplight. Sometimes I would speak publicly. Other nights people simply asked me to remember aloud. One evening a young woman asked quietly, "What was the first thing you noticed about him?" The room grew still. I thought for a long moment before answering. He noticed people no one else saw. Her eyes narrowed slightly with curiosity. "What do you mean?" I smiled faintly. In Nazareth, there was an old man everyone avoided because his hands shook badly. He spilled things, spoke too slowly, smelled of sickness. Several people nodded knowingly. Every village had such people. One winter morning I watched Jesus stop while everyone else hurried past. He helped the man carry firewood all the way home in the rain. I paused. When I asked why, he answered, "Loneliness is a heavy thing for old men to carry alone." Silence settled across the room afterward. Not dramatic silence, tender silence. The kind truth leaves behind when it reaches wounded places. As years passed, I noticed something strange. The more people loved him, the more they longed to know him personally. Not merely as Messiah, as Jesus, the man who ate with fishermen, the teacher who blessed children, the son who cared for his mother, the brother who laughed during meals and worked until his hands blistered. Perhaps that is why God chose to come among us this way. Not distant, near enough to touch, near enough to wound, near enough to love. One night after prayer, a young boy approached me while others prepared food nearby. He could not have been older than 8. "Is it true," he whispered carefully, "that he made storms stop?" I smiled. "Yes." The child's eyes widened with awe. "Were you there?" "No." "Then how do you know?" I looked around the crowded room, filled with believers sharing bread together peacefully, despite danger waiting outside those walls. Then I answered, "Because the men who saw it were never the same afterward." The boy considered this seriously. Then he asked the question children often ask better than scholars. Did he ever get afraid? For a moment memory struck me hard. Gethsemane, the trial, the cross. I lowered myself slowly beside the child. Yes, I said quietly, but fear never ruled him. That felt important. Courage is not the absence of fear. Rome had fearless men. So did thieves, so did murderers. But my brother possessed something rarer, perfect love stronger than fear itself. Jerusalem meanwhile grew darker with every passing season. Roman soldiers multiplied in the city streets. Zealots whispered openly in marketplaces now. Executions became more common outside the gates. Everyone sensed violence approaching eventually. You could feel it beneath ordinary conversations like distant thunder beneath clear skies. And still the believers gathered. Still they fed the hungry. Still they prayed for enemies. Still they repeated his teachings quietly in crowded homes while the empire surrounding them sharpened its swords. At times even I wondered how such gentleness could survive against the brutality of the world. Then I remembered the cross. Rome had already unleashed its full violence upon him, and love had risen afterward anyway. I often walked the temple courts alone before sunrise. Those quiet hours became precious to me. Jerusalem looked almost innocent then. Cold morning air drifted through the colonnades while priests prepared offerings in silence. Doves fluttered among the high stones. Lamps still burned faintly in the distance before dawn fully arrived. And there, in the stillness, memory returned strongest. I could almost hear him teaching again. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the peacemakers. Love your enemies. No one speaks like that unless heaven truly sent him. Not for long. The world teaches survival through strength. My brother taught surrender through love. And somehow his way proved stronger than Rome itself. One morning, an elderly priest approached me privately near the outer courts. I recognized him immediately. Years earlier, he had argued publicly against Jesus during Passover. Age had bent him now. His beard had gone nearly white. For several moments he said nothing. Then quietly, I still remember his voice. I waited. The old priest swallowed hard. When he spoke scripture, his eyes lowered. It felt alive again. Pain crossed his face unexpectedly. I fought him because I feared what would happen to our nation. And now? I asked gently. He looked around the temple slowly. At times I fear we rejected the very peace sent to save us. His words lingered between us heavily. I thought of my brother weeping over Jerusalem before his death. How many warnings had we ignored because they arrived clothed in humility rather than power? That evening I climbed the rooftop alone after everyone slept. Jerusalem glowed beneath thousands of distant lamps. Voices drifted upward through the night air. Dogs barked somewhere beyond the lower streets. Roman torches flickered near the fortress walls like watchful eyes. And suddenly I remembered Nazareth with aching clarity. Jesus sitting outside after work watching swallows circle the rooftops at dusk. Joseph shaping cedar beside the doorway. Mother singing softly while preparing bread. The ordinary holiness of those lost years nearly overwhelmed me. How strange that the salvation of the world once slept beneath a simple roof in Galilee. How strange that eternity once carried water jars through dusty streets. I closed my eyes then and whispered into the night, I miss you, brother. The wind moved softly across the rooftop. And though he did not answer aloud, peace settled over me once more, the same way it always had near him. Steady, quiet, living. Chapter 14. Rumors of War. The city began sounding different before it changed. People think destruction arrives suddenly, like lightning splitting cedar trees in a single strike. But most disasters announce themselves slowly first, in restless voices, in bitter conversations, in hatred repeated so often it begins sounding righteous. Jerusalem had become loud with anger. Every marketplace carried arguments about Rome. Young zealots whispered in corners, believing knives could accomplish what holiness had not. Priests spoke anxiously behind guarded walls, while Roman soldiers marched the streets with increasing suspicion. Fear fed everything. And fear, when worshipped long enough, eventually demands blood. I felt it growing every day. The believers continued gathering despite the tension spreading through the city. Some urged caution now. Keep meetings smaller. Do not attract attention. Rome is watching everyone. Others believed judgment approached Jerusalem itself, not because God delighted in punishment, because violence was becoming the language of the city. My brother had warned about this. I remembered standing near the temple years earlier while he looked across Jerusalem with tears in his eyes. At the time, I barely understood his grief. Now I did. He loved this city deeply, and because he loved it, he mourned what pride would eventually bring upon it. One evening, several young men came to speak with me after prayer. I recognized the look in their eyes immediately. Zeal. Dangerous zeal. One spoke first. Rabbi, how long must we endure Rome? Another clenched his jaw tightly. God did not make Israel for chains. Others murmured agreement. I studied them quietly before answering. And what will you build with hatred once Rome burns? The first man frowned. Freedom. No, I said gently. Men ruled by hatred carry their chains into every victory. That angered some of them immediately. You speak softly because you are old. One snapped. But we are tired of humiliation. For a brief moment, silence settled heavily over the room. Then I answered with the memory of my brother burning inside me. I watched Rome nail the only truly innocent man I have ever known to wood. Their eyes fixed upon me. And he still forgave them. No one replied after that. Some truths exposed the soul too sharply for argument. Later that night, I remained awake long after the others slept. The younger men frightened me, not because they desired freedom. Freedom is good, but because rage had begun disguising itself as righteousness throughout Jerusalem. And rage always consumes more than its enemies eventually. I had seen enough death to know this. Rome crucified bodies, hatred crucified souls. The next morning I walked through the lower markets alone beneath grey skies, heavy with approaching rain. Merchants shouted prices, while soldiers watched nearby with hands resting on spear shafts. Beggars huddled near walls hoping for scraps. Priests moved quickly through the crowds, pretending calmness they no longer truly felt. Then I heard my brother's name spoken behind me. 2 travelers from Galilee argued beside a fruit stall. I tell you, one insisted, if the rulers had listened to Jesus, none of this unrest would exist now. The other shook his head bitterly. Peace does not stop armies. I almost turned then, almost spoke, but instead I remained silent, listening. Because perhaps that was the question dividing all Jerusalem still. Can peace truly overcome power? Rome answered no, the cross answered yes, and resurrection sealed the answer forever. That afternoon, rain finally came. Heavy rain. Water poured through the streets while thunder rolled above the city walls. Most people rushed indoors, but I remained beneath the temple colonnades watching the storm. Rain always reminded me of Nazareth. I remembered one storm from childhood vividly. Lightning shook the house hard enough to wake all of us. Our youngest sister began crying, while wind hammered the shutters violently. Jesus rose immediately and moved calmly through the darkness, securing windows and comforting everyone before fear spread further. Afterward, while thunder still rolled beyond the hills, I asked him, "How are you never afraid?" He smiled while relighting the lamp. "I did not say I never feel fear." "Then why stay calm?" He looked toward the storm outside before answering, "Because panic helps darkness grow louder." At the time I thought it another strange answer. Years later I understood he had lived that way in everything. He entered fear without surrendering to it. That is real courage. As evening approached, the rain slowed to mist drifting across Jerusalem's rooftops. Several believers gathered with me that night in a small upper room near the southern quarter of the city. An older woman there asked quietly, "Do you think he knew all this would happen?" Everyone understood what she meant. The unrest, the violence coming, the suffering ahead for many of us. I stared into the oil lamp between us for several moments before answering, "Yes." The room remained silent. Then I added softly, "And he loved us anyway." Those words struck me deeply even as I spoke them. Because love that survives certainty of suffering is the holiest thing I have ever witnessed. Most men love when outcomes appear safe. My brother loved knowing nails waited ahead. After the others departed, a young believer remained behind, helping extinguish lamps. He hesitated before speaking. "Rabbi, do you ever wish you had believed sooner?" The question pierced more deeply than he intended. I thought of Nazareth, of arguments beside the workshop, of mocking him, of standing uncertain while crowds condemned him. Regret stirred painfully even after all these years. "Yes," I admitted quietly. The young man lowered his eyes respectfully. "But," I continued after a moment, "mercy reached me anyway." That mattered, because if my brother welcomed even doubting brothers after resurrection, then no wounded soul stood beyond hope. That night sleep came slowly. The city outside groaned restlessly beneath gathering tensions, while memories moved through my mind like lantern light across old walls. I remembered Jesus sitting beside me as boys beneath the stars outside Nazareth. I had asked him then, "Do you think Israel will ever be free?" He looked upward for a long moment before answering, "One day every chain will break." At the time I imagined swords, battles, kings falling. Now, after years walking in his shadow, I understood. The deepest chains in men are not forged by Rome, and the freedom he brought could survive even crucifixion itself. That is why empires feared him without understanding why. And that is why, long after Caesar's palaces become dust, my brother's name will still live upon human lips. Chapter 15. The Holy City. Jerusalem was beautiful in the mornings. That made its corruption harder to bear. At dawn, the temple stones caught sunlight before the rest of the city awakened fully. Gold and white shimmered above the rooftops, while cool wind drifted through the streets carrying the scent of bread ovens and incense. Pilgrims arriving for prayer often stopped speechless at the sight. And for a moment, before greed and violence resumed their noise, the city almost resembled what God intended it to be. Almost! I loved Jerusalem despite its wounds, perhaps because my brother loved it first. He wept for this city. Not for Rome, not for himself, for Jerusalem. Only love mourns that deeply. I continued teaching openly near the temple during those years, though many warned me to stop. The priests grow impatient. Rome watches everything now. You should speak more carefully. Perhaps they were right, but age changes a man strangely. Fear weakens when enough years pass. And after seeing resurrection with my own eyes, threats no longer carried the same authority they once did. So I spoke, not loudly, not rebelliously, simply truthfully. I spoke about mercy, about repentance, about loving enemies, about my brother who forgave men while they hammered nails through his hands. Some listened with tears. Others listened with clenched fists. Truth always reveals what lives inside people already. One afternoon, a wealthy merchant approached me publicly near the outer courts. His robes were expensive, his beard carefully oiled. Rings flashed on his fingers when he gestured. "Rabbi," he said loudly enough for others nearby to hear, "you speak often of humility, yet your followers dishonor successful men." Several people stopped to listen. I answered calmly, "My brother honored generosity, not status." The merchant frowned. "Is wealth evil, then?" "No. Then why do your teachings trouble prosperous men?" I looked around at the beggars sitting along the temple walls nearby. "Because prosperous men often stop noticing the hungry." Silence spread briefly around us. The merchant's expression hardened immediately. "Truth wounds pride before it heals the heart." He turned away offended, but one of the beggars nearby quietly whispered, "Your brother used to see us too." That mattered more to me than winning arguments. Jesus never came merely to defeat people in debate. He came to awaken deadened hearts. The believers continued multiplying quietly despite opposition. Entire families joined us now. Travelers returned to distant towns carrying the teachings farther every season. Songs about my brother began appearing among gatherings in languages I did not even recognize fully. At times this astonished me deeply. I remembered him walking dusty roads in Galilee with only a handful of followers beside him. Now his name crossed borders. Empires spread through violence. His kingdom spread through transformed lives. No sword in history had ever accomplished that. Yet danger never disappeared. Temple leaders questioned me repeatedly during those years. Some hated us openly, others seemed torn inwardly, trapped between fear of losing authority and the strange pull my brother's teachings still carried even after death. One older priest stopped me privately near the eastern gate one evening. "You still speak his name boldly," he said quietly. "Yes." "Even now?" I looked toward the temple rising above us. "Especially now." The old priest sighed heavily. "You know Rome will eventually destroy anyone who threatens order." At once memory flashed through me. The cross, the nails, the empty tomb. "Rome already tried," I answered softly. The priest stared at me a long moment without speaking. Then he walked away, troubled. Tonight, after the city quieted, memory often returned stronger than sleep. I would remember ordinary moments unexpectedly. Jesus repairing a cracked stool while humming psalms beneath his breath. Mother smiling faintly while listening to him teach our younger brothers. Joseph correcting my measurements while Jesus tried unsuccessfully not to laugh beside him. Such small memories became treasures with age. People often imagine holiness revealed only through miracles. But I tell you now, there was holiness in the hidden years too. Holiness in patience, in labor, in quiet kindness no crowds applauded. Perhaps those years prepared him more than anyone realized. A man who cannot live faithfully in obscurity cannot carry glory without corruption. My brother carried both perfectly. One evening several children gathered around me after prayer, asking questions all at once. Did he really walk on water? Did he know everyone's thoughts? Could he call down angels? I laughed despite myself. Children ask directly what adults hide behind careful language. Finally, one little girl tugged my sleeve and asked softly, "Was he gentle?" The room became quiet. I lowered myself beside her slowly. "Yes," I whispered, "stronger than any man I have ever known, and gentler too." That combination still amazes me most. Rome understood power without gentleness. Religious leaders often understood holiness without mercy. But in Jesus, strength and compassion lived together completely. That is why children trusted him, and why proud men feared him. As years passed, my body weakened, but my memories sharpened. Sometimes while walking through Jerusalem, I would suddenly expect to see him turning a corner ahead of me. A glimpse of familiar shoulders in a crowded street. A voice laughing nearby. Then reality returned again. Absence has weight, especially after love. Yet even grief had changed after resurrection. Before seeing him alive, death felt final. Now death felt more like a doorway standing open somewhere ahead. Still painful, still terrible, but no longer victorious. My brother changed even morning itself. One morning before sunrise, I climbed alone to the temple heights overlooking the city. Jerusalem still slept beneath fading stars, while cool wind moved across the rooftops. From there I could see nearly everything. The narrow streets, the markets, the Roman fortress looming beside the temple like a reminder of foreign power. And suddenly I remembered standing there years earlier beside Jesus before his final Passover. He had looked across the city silently for a long time. Then tears filled his eyes. At the time I barely understood why. Now I did. He saw what violence would eventually bring upon these stones. He saw hearts too hardened to recognize peace standing directly before them. And still he loved the city enough to weep for it. Only God loves like that. That evening after prayer, one of the younger believers asked me quietly, "Rabbi, after everything you witnessed, what do you believe matters most?" I thought of miracles, of crowds, of the empty tomb. Then strangely my mind returned not first to glory, but to Nazareth, to ordinary evenings beneath Galilean skies, to my brother carrying water for mother before she asked, to him stopping for lonely people everyone else ignored, to forgiveness spoken from a cross. And finally I answered, "That love is stronger than death." The room fell silent afterward. Not because the answer sounded grand, because everyone there knew how costly such love truly is. Chapter 16. The Brother I Remember. People speak of my brother now with titles: Messiah, Lord, Son of David, the Holy One. And all those names are true. But age has taught me something strange. The memories dearest to me are not always the grand ones, not the crowds, not the wonders, not even the empty tomb. I treasure the small things most now, the ordinary moments where glory hid itself inside simple life. I remember one winter in Nazareth when food grew scarce after poor harvests across Galilee. Everyone became sharper during those months. Hungry people lose patience quickly. Arguments spread through the village over grain, taxes, and debts. One evening, a widow came to our house asking Joseph for more time to repay what she owed for repairs. Joseph listened quietly while she spoke, embarrassed nearly to tears. Before he could answer, Jesus disappeared briefly into the back room. He returned carrying part of our own stored grain. Mother looked startled. So did I. We did not possess extra food to spare easily. The widow protested immediately. No, your family needs this. Jesus smiled softly. So do you. After she left, I complained bitterly. What happens when we run short ourselves? He continued repairing a broken chair calmly before answering. Then perhaps someone will show us mercy too. At the time, I thought him unrealistic. Now I understand he saw the world differently than the rest of us. Most men guard what they possess. My brother gave as though heaven itself could not run empty. I remember his laughter too. People often imagine holy men as severe creatures who move through life frowning at joy. That was never Jesus. He laughed deeply, especially with children. Once during a wedding celebration in Cana, Simon slipped while carrying wine and crashed directly into a water basin before half the courtyard. The entire gathering erupted in laughter, including Jesus. He laughed so hard, Tears formed in his eyes while Simon shouted in embarrassment from the floor. Even Mother covered her mouth, trying unsuccessfully to hide her amusement. For years afterward, Jesus would still grin whenever Simon carried anything fragile. Holiness without joy becomes cold quickly. My brother carried joy naturally, not shallow happiness, something steadier, like light surviving even inside sorrow. Yet there were moments when silence gathered around him differently, especially at night. Sometimes after long days of labor, I would find him sitting alone outside the house watching the stars over Galilee. Not sad, listening, as though creation itself spoke quietly to him. Once I sat beside him after everyone else slept. For a long time neither of us spoke. Then finally I asked, "What do you think about out here alone so often?" He smiled faintly without taking his eyes from the sky. "How much God loves the world." I snorted softly. "Looking at stars makes you think about love?" "Yes. That makes no sense." At last he looked toward me. "James, people fear how small they are beneath the heavens." He pointed upward. "But I think the stars reveal how great love must be for God to know every soul beneath them." I remember falling silent after that, because even before miracles, my brother spoke as though eternity rested close enough for him to touch. One thing people rarely understand about him is this: he noticed exhaustion in others immediately. Not weakness, weariness. There is a difference. He saw burdens people tried hiding. Once, while traveling near Capernaum, we passed a farmer struggling alone with a broken cart wheel beneath brutal heat. Others walked by pretending not to notice. Jesus stopped immediately. "We should help him." I groaned aloud. "We'll lose half the day." "Yes," he answered calmly, "but he may lose the whole harvest." So we stopped. Hours passed lifting the cart, repairing the axle, and helping reload supplies, while the farmer apologized repeatedly for delaying us. When we finally continued down the road, sweat-soaked and exhausted, I muttered, "You help everyone." Jesus looked ahead thoughtfully. "People carry invisible weights." That sentence returned to me countless times afterward, especially in Jerusalem. The proud carried fear, the poor carried despair, the violent carried rage, the lonely carried silence. And somehow my brother always saw beneath appearances directly into the hidden burden. I also remember his anger. Yes, anger, but never selfish anger, never petty cruelty. He became angry when dignity was crushed, when the weak were exploited, when religion became performance instead of holiness. I saw that fire most clearly in the temple during Passover. The sound of tables overturning still echoes in memory sometimes. Coins scattering across stone, animals crying out, merchants shouting, and Jesus standing there with righteous fury burning through him like storm fire. Yet even then hatred never ruled him. That is the difference between holy anger and human rage. Human rage seeks destruction. Holy anger seeks restoration. One evening years after resurrection, a young believer asked me, "What astonished you most about him?" I thought carefully before answering. Not the miracles, though they were wondrous, not even the resurrection itself. What astonished me most was this: power never corrupted him. I had seen men gain tiny authority in villages and become arrogant within days. But my brother carried authority greater than kings while washing feet like a servant. That is not natural to mankind. That is heaven revealed. As I grew older, grief and gratitude became nearly impossible to separate. I missed him constantly, especially during ordinary moments, at meals, during prayer, while watching children play in dusty streets. Absence lingered sharply because memory remained alive, yet gratitude rose alongside the ache. Because I had known him. Not merely heard stories. Known him. I knew the sound of his footsteps returning home after long days. I knew how he smiled before answering difficult questions. I knew the gentleness in his voice when speaking to Mother. I knew the scars on his hands before nails ever pierced them. And perhaps most astonishing of all, he knew me fully too. My jealousy and my pride, my doubt, my fear, yet he loved me anyway. That remains the deepest miracle of my life. One night, unable to sleep, I walked alone through Jerusalem beneath cold moonlight. The streets had mostly emptied. Roman patrols moved in the distance carrying torches through the dark, while wind drifted softly between stone walls. I climbed toward the rooftop overlooking the city, and stood there long in silence. Then, unexpectedly, I remembered something from childhood. I must have been perhaps 10 years old. A storm frightened me badly one night in Nazareth. Thunder shook the house hard enough to wake everyone. Rain hammered the roof, while lightning flashed through the shutters. I remember lying awake, terrified. Then Jesus sat beside me quietly in the darkness. "You're afraid," he said gently. "I hate storms." For a moment he listened to the thunder outside. Then he placed a hand on my shoulder. "Even storms obey God." Simple words, childhood words. Yet years later I watched him command a storm over Galilee itself and realized he had spoken with the calm certainty of someone who knew the wind personally. Standing above Jerusalem all those years later, I smiled through tears remembering it, because even before I understood who he truly was, part of me always knew there was something in him greater than the world itself. Chapter 17. The Gathering Shadows. The years moved faster once my hair turned white. Young believers who once sat listening at my feet began bringing their own children to the gatherings. Boys became fathers, girls became mothers. Some of the old faces disappeared one by one into death, leaving empty spaces at tables where laughter once lived. And Jerusalem grew more dangerous with every passing season. The city no longer merely carried anger. It breathed it. Roman soldiers patrolled in larger numbers now. Zealots recruited openly among frustrated young men. Public executions became common enough that children no longer stared long at crosses outside the gates. That frightened me deeply. When death becomes ordinary to a people, mercy begins dying too. One afternoon I walked through the market near the southern quarter of the city and saw two young men nearly come to blows over politics. One shouted that Rome deserved blood. The other warned rebellion would destroy Jerusalem. Crowds gathered instantly, hungry for conflict. That hunger disturbed me most. Violence excites fallen hearts quickly. I stepped between them before fists could rise fully. Enough. Both men recognized me and hesitated reluctantly. The angrier of the two pointed toward the Roman fortress towering above the city. How much longer should Israel bow to pagans? I understood the pain beneath his words. Every Jew in Jerusalem carried humiliation beneath Roman occupation like a stone in the chest. Still, I answered carefully. If hatred rules you before victory comes, hatred will rule you afterward too. The young man clenched his jaw. So we do nothing? I remembered my brother standing before Pilate, bruised and bleeding, while refusing the path of violence. No, I said softly. We become different men. Many considered that weakness. But I had seen Rome unleash its full power upon perfect innocence, and still love rose afterward stronger than empire. That evening, several believers gathered in a crowded upper room while rain tapped softly against the rooftop above us. An older woman who had followed Jesus during the Galilean days sat near the fire, quietly listening while others spoke. Her face carried deep lines from years of sorrow and endurance. At one point she smiled faintly and said, He always knew when people were hurting before they spoke. Everyone fell silent immediately. I nodded slowly. Yes. She laughed softly to herself. Once I tried hiding grief from him because I did not want to burden anyone. He looked at me only once and said, "You do not have to carry sorrow alone anymore." Tears filled her eyes. I still do not know how he saw so deeply. I did, or at least I believed I did now. Love notices what selfishness overlooks, and no man ever loved more completely than my brother. After the gathering ended, I remained awake long after midnight. Jerusalem lay restless beneath dark skies. Even from the rooftop I could hear distant shouting somewhere near the lower city, where drunken arguments often became violence after sunset. I thought of Nazareth then with sudden aching clarity. The quiet hills, the smell of fresh cedar in Joseph's workshop, Mother singing softly while preparing bread, and Jesus sitting outside at dusk, watching birds circle above the rooftops. How peaceful those years seemed now. At the time I thought life there small and ordinary. Now I understood holiness had once walked hidden through those dusty streets while the world remained blind. The next morning I visited the temple courts before sunrise. Few people moved through the colonnades at that hour, besides priests preparing for morning offerings and laborers cleaning the outer areas. I preferred the silence before crowds arrived. There, in stillness, memory often returned strongest. As dawn light slowly touched the great stones, I suddenly remembered another morning years earlier, the morning after resurrection, the rooftop, his voice speaking my name. I closed my eyes briefly against the emotion rising unexpectedly within me. Age does not weaken certain memories. It sharpens them, especially holy ones. A young priest approached me cautiously that morning. I recognized him vaguely from previous encounters near the temple. "You are James," he said quietly. "Yes." He hesitated before continuing. "My father opposed your brother strongly." I remained silent. The young priest lowered his eyes. "But before his death, he admitted something to me." "What was that?" The priest swallowed hard. He said when Jesus spoke, it felt like the prophets had returned after centuries of silence. Emotion flickered across the young man's face. "I think about that often." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then I answered softly, "So do I." As the years passed, many asked me why my brother chose suffering instead of power. Even believers struggled with this sometimes. The world understands conquest through force. It does not understand triumph through sacrifice. One evening, a young zealot asked me directly, "If Jesus truly possessed authority from God, why allow himself to be crucified?" I studied the young man carefully before answering. "Because force can control behavior." He frowned. "But only love transforms hearts." The zealot shook his head skeptically. "That sounds beautiful," he said. "But Rome still rules us." I thought of the countless believers now scattered across lands Rome could never fully control. Then I answered, "Empires rule bodies for a season. Truth rules souls long after empires fall." He did not reply, perhaps because somewhere deep inside he feared it might be true. That night sleep escaped me again. It often did in old age. I walked alone through the quiet house where several believers now stayed, together near the western quarter of Jerusalem. Oil lamps flickered softly against the walls while exhausted travelers slept wrapped in blankets nearby. One young child stirred awake as I passed. "Rabbi?" he whispered sleepily. "Yes." "Will Jesus come again?" The innocence of the question pierced me deeply. I knelt beside him slowly. "Yes," I answered. How do you know? At once I saw again the empty tomb, the scars in his hands, the peace in his eyes stronger than death, and I smiled gently, because he keeps every promise. The child fell asleep again, almost immediately afterward. But I remained there beside the doorway for a long time, listening to the quiet breathing of the gathered believers. So fragile, so ordinary, and yet carrying within them the memory of a kingdom no empire could extinguish. But before dawn finally came, I climbed once more to the rooftop overlooking Jerusalem. The city slept uneasily beneath fading stars, while Roman fires burned along the fortress walls. I thought then about all the things my brother could have become in the eyes of the world. A king, a conqueror, a revolutionary. Crowds would have followed him easily down those roads. Instead, he chose mercy, humility, suffering. At times, even now, I still marvel at that choice. Then I remembered his face the morning after resurrection, the calm certainty in his voice, and suddenly I understood again. He did not choose the cross because he lacked power. He chose it because love was the greater power all along. Chapter 18. The Last Passover. I knew death was drawing near long before anyone spoke it aloud. Perhaps age teaches a man to recognize the sound of closing doors. Or perhaps after walking beside holiness long enough, the soul grows quieter and notices eternity standing nearby. Jerusalem had become unbearably tense by then. Roman soldiers watched every gathering with suspicion. Zealots sharpened hatred into open violence. Priests argued among themselves behind guarded walls, while whispers of rebellion spread through every quarter of the city. And among all this unrest, the believers continued gathering quietly in homes, praying and breaking bread together as my brother taught us long ago. Simple acts, yet somehow stronger than swords. One evening during Passover season, several younger believers sat with me long after supper, while oil lamps burned low around the room. Outside, the city murmured restlessly beneath the night. One of the younger men finally asked what many had wondered privately for years. "Rabbi, after everything, what do you fear most now?" I smiled faintly at the question. When I was young, the answer would have come quickly. Rome. Shame, failure, death. But age changes fear. I looked around at the faces gathered near me, some young enough to still believe suffering can always be avoided, others already carrying grief in their eyes. Then I answered honestly, "I fear becoming unlike him." The room fell silent, because that was the deepest danger. Not dying, not persecution. Allowing bitterness, pride, or hatred to remake the heart into something smaller than love. Rome could wound the body. Only fear could corrupt the soul, and my brother had already shown us another way. That night after the others slept, I remained awake listening to distant sounds drifting through Jerusalem. Footsteps in narrow streets, dogs barking somewhere near the lower markets, Roman armor clattering faintly in the distance. The city sounded tired. I thought again of Nazareth. How strange that memory sharpens with age instead of fading. I could still smell cedar in Joseph's workshop if I closed my eyes long enough. Still hear Mother humming softly while kneading bread before sunrise. Still see Jesus sitting outside at dusk, watching swallows wheel above the rooftops. No crowd surrounded him there. No one called him Messiah. He was simply my brother. And perhaps that is the memory dearest to me now. That before miracles and resurrection and kingdoms, holiness lived quietly among ordinary people without demanding greatness from them first. The following morning I went alone to pray near the temple before dawn. Cold wind moved through the outer courts while the first hints of sunlight touched the eastern sky beyond Jerusalem. I knelt slowly, my knees aching harder than they once had. Age humbles the body eventually, no matter how stubborn the spirit remains. For a long time I prayed in silence. For the believers, for Jerusalem, for mercy upon the city still racing toward violence. Then unexpectedly memory flooded me once more. I saw Jesus as clearly as if he stood beside me again. Not the risen Lord in glory, not the suffering man beneath the cross. The boy from Nazareth smiling while handing bread to mother across the table. And suddenly tears filled my eyes, because after all these years, after all the miracles and suffering and wonder, love remained the center of everything. Not power, not fear, not empire, love, the kind willing to kneel beside the broken, the kind willing to forgive enemies, the kind willing to suffer rather than become cruel. Only God could love like that perfectly. And somehow, impossibly, I had grown up beside him. The persecution intensified soon afterward. Temple authorities questioned me repeatedly in public. Some warned me privately to stop speaking about Jesus altogether. "You are old now," one council member told me. "Leave these matters behind and live peacefully." But how could I? I had seen the tomb empty. I had touched the scars in my brother's hands. Peace purchased through silence would not truly be peace at all. So I continued teaching openly. Not with anger, not with rebellion, simply truthfully. Jesus is alive. Love your enemies. Do not repay evil with evil. God's kingdom belongs to the humble. The world has always hated such teachings because they expose how deeply pride rules human hearts. One afternoon, several believers begged me to leave Jerusalem entirely. "Please," a young woman pleaded, tears filling her eyes. "They mean to kill you." I placed my hand gently over hers. My brother once walked this city knowing death waited ahead. That is exactly why you should leave. I understood her fear. I felt it too, but fear no longer ruled me as it once had. I smiled softly. If resurrection is true, then death is not the end of the story. Those words did not erase her grief, but they carried peace into the room all the same. The day finally came beneath a grey sky, heavy with rain. Crowds gathered near the temple while accusations rose once more against me publicly. Some shouted for silence. Others defended me. I heard my brother's name cursed openly by men who believed holiness could be protected through violence. How little the world changes! They demanded I deny him, deny the resurrection, deny the Messiah. Instead, I spoke his name clearly before them all. Jesus, my brother, the risen Lord, the one who forgave from the cross, the one death could not hold. The crowd erupted afterward, some in fury, some in sorrow, and strangely peace settled over me fully for the first time in many years. Because suddenly I understood something beautiful. I was no longer afraid of joining him. As they dragged me towards the temple heights, rain began falling softly across Jerusalem. I remembered another storm long ago in Nazareth. I had been frightened as a child while thunder shook the house. Jesus sat beside me in the darkness and said gently, "Even storms obey God." Standing there at the edge of death decades later, I finally understood. Not even death itself stands outside his authority. My body weakened quickly afterward. Pain blurred moments into fragments, voices shouting, rain striking stone, hands lifting me, and through it all, memory burned brightly. Nazareth, the hills of Galilee, the empty tomb, my brother smiling beneath morning light after resurrection. I prayed then, not for vengeance, but mercy, the same mercy he showed even while dying. Because love had remade me slowly into something closer to him than I once believed possible. My final thoughts were not of Rome, nor fear, nor suffering. I thought of home, of Jesus laughing beside the workshop, of mother singing softly while evening lamps flickered, of dusty roads in Galilee glowing gold at sunset. And I realized then that heaven had touched earth there long before anyone understood what they were witnessing. The Messiah had lived among us quietly, as son, brother, friend, teacher, savior. And though empires would rise and fall afterward, though Jerusalem itself would one day burn beneath war, one truth would remain forever unchanged. Love had entered the world wearing human hands, and death itself had failed to destroy it. Conclusion. The story remembered. If these words survive me, let them carry this truth above all others. My brother was exactly who he claimed to be. Not merely prophet, not merely teacher, not merely righteous man. I doubted him once. I resisted him. I stood near enough to hear his voice daily and still failed to understand him fully. Yet I saw him alive after crucifixion, and no man willingly dies for what he knows to be false after touching resurrection with his own eyes. But beyond miracles, beyond wonders, beyond even the empty tomb, remember this most carefully. He loved completely. The poor, the sinner, the child, the outcast. Even enemies, especially enemies. The world still believes power changes hearts. My brother proved love stronger. I know this because I watched both Rome and death itself try to silence him, and still his kingdom grows. Not through fear, through transformed lives. So if you speak his name generations from now, do not remember only the cross. Remember Nazareth too. Remember the carpenter carrying wood through dusty streets. Remember the brother who laughed at wedding feasts. Remember the son who cared for his mother. Remember the man who stopped for lonely people everyone else ignored. Because holiness once lived among ordinary life so gently that many failed to recognize heaven standing beside them. I was one of them, until the morning he called my name after death itself surrendered him back to the world. And from that day onward I understood. The light truly had come into the world, and no darkness would ever overcome it.